history of the Supernova and Waikiki Wave type ride stretches back to 1987, before the first rides we now consider to be topspins were ever introduced. Vekoma was the first one to make a ride like this. Named the Canyon Trip, it was introduced in 1987. This ride has two straight arms, just like the now ubiquitous topspin, but unlike the topspin, the arms could rotate separated from each other. To allow that, the gondola consisted of two separate parts, located on three big metal columns. This allowed the main gondola to move in two parts, towards and away from each other, leading to a thrilling feeling that the two halves of the gondola would crash into each other.
Each part of the gondola had 5 rows of 4 seats each, making for a capacity of 40 riders per cycle. While the left side of the gondola was fixed, the right side of the gondola could slide forwards and backwards. The further the ends of both arms were from each other, the more space between the gondola. 3 of these rides were produced, and they went on to inspire a huge number of rides with a similar design.
All of these rides that we're aware of were most likely introduced in 1987. In no particular order, there was Gladiator's Gauntlet at Busch Gardens, Williamsburg. This ride opened in 1987 and ran until 1993. After that, we're not really sure what happened to it. We also have the Canyon Trip, just named Canyon Trip. It was first located at Morey's Piers in the US. This was from 1987 up until 1988. Then it was relocated to the American Adventure theme park in the UK, where it operated from 1991 to 1994. It was then relocated to its final home at Camelot theme park, where it was named The Rack, and it operated there from 1995 until 2010.
And then we have one more in Japan, in Nagashima Spaland. It was also said to be named Canyon Trip. The opening dates and closure dates are not sure at all, but from what I can find, it opened somewhere around 1987 and it closed between 1993 and 1996. And then Vekoma introduced the Waikiki Wave in 1991 as a newer version of the Canyon Trip. Unlike the Canyon Trip, the Waikiki Wave uses a normal gondola with riders seated facing outwards on each side, with 20 seats per side, making for a capacity of 40 riders per cycle, just like the Canyon Trip. To allow the arms to rotate separated from each other, the ride used a bending arm system.
When the ride is parked in the loading position, both arms are parallel to each other. Once the two arms begin to move at different speeds and in different directions, part of one arm will bend inwards towards the center to allow the gondola to move. The more both ends of the arms move away from each other, the more the bottom of one arm will bend inwards. This system is very similar to what Mondial used on their Supernova, which debuted 2 years prior to this ride, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment.
The first Waikiki Wave was sold in 1991 to the South Korean theme park named Lotto World. Sadly, it got removed after the 2012 season and it was replaced by a Zamperla Disco.
Six Flags Kentucky Kingdom also bought a Waikiki Wave. It was named the Quake. The ride sadly did not survive the 10-year closure of Kentucky Kingdom and is presumed to be scrapped.
At least 8 standard Waikiki Waves were produced. Sadly, only one of them remains operating today at Tashkentland in Uzbekistan.
2 years after the introduction of the original Canyon Trip, Mondial introduced the Supernova in 1989. The Supernova used a more traditional design than the Vekoma models. It featured a gondola with riders seated facing forwards, utilizing only a lap bar restraint compared to the over-the-shoulder restraints used on the Vekoma rides, with a capacity of 48 riders per cycle. It used a tilting arm design much like the later Waikiki Wave. The gondola could tip up to 90 degrees in any direction. The ride was operated via joystick, leading to no two cycles being the same.
Mondial intended this ride to be family-friendly while still exciting. This design proved to be a success as 11 of these rides would end up being produced, more than any other non-inverting ride of this type. 8 of these rides still remain operating, though 2 of them only appear sporadically. Most are traveling rides, though some were installed at parks, 2 of them. One at Alton Towers, which was named Bone Shaker and closed in 2003 and is now operating at Iberia Park or Terra Mythica in Spain. No more Supernovas were sold after 1995, with the model being officially discontinued in 2001.
Sariani and Moser introduced the Canyon Raft also in 1989. These rides were very similar to the Supernova, except the seats faced each other rather than all of them facing forwards. These rides also used over-the-shoulder restraints rather than lap bars found on the Supernova. Not much is known about this ride other than that at least 3 were produced and they are no longer in production. And though all of the rides listed above are no longer in production, Mondial is working to bring the design back with the still in development Mondial Blender. This ride works somewhat like a Supernova, but instead of the traditional gondola, it features 2 rotating arms with suspended seats. Much like the older Mondial rides, this ride will use lap bars as its primary restraint. Sadly, none have been sold as of 2021, and the ride is still in development.
So now I'm gonna tell a bit about my own experience with the Supernova. I have gotten a chance to ride a Supernova from Mondial, to be specific, the one at Terra Mythica, named La Colera de Aquiles. It is the one which was previously located at Alton Towers, and sadly it runs on an automatic cycle. But that's nothing new because it already operated an automatic cycle at Alton Towers. At Alton Towers it was relocated 3 times, and when it was first relocated, it was changed from manual to automatic for a very weird reason, at least a rumor says that. So the rumors say that 2 operators were having a challenge to see who could get the gondola the closest to flipping, and it is said that they got to flip the gondola, and that's why Alton Towers decided to give it a automatic cycle. So that's just a rumor. I'm absolutely not sure if this is real or not, but if it is real, that's really funny and kind of ridiculous how these 2 operators managed to make this have an automatic cycle. The automatic cycle it has today is really bad. It only runs in one direction. The arms don't separate from each other that much, and the gondola barely gets any swing, so it's really boring. Still kind of fun, but it's really sad to see a ride with such great potential being operated like this, as you can see in the footage. Yeah, I really don't feel like I have experienced a Supernova because the cycle was so bad.
Yeah, it's definitely disappointing to see it operated like that, but there are still some traveling ones that do still have that manual cycle and are still look pretty fun. But it's definitely a hard to find ride model that if you do spot, you should definitely go ahead and ride it. Following the success of the original Waikiki Wave, Vekoma introduced the Waikiki Wave Superflip in 1993. This was an upgraded version of the Waikiki Wave. Compared to the standard version, Superflip has brakes added to the gondola with an additional lap bar, kind of like what the Huss Topspin has. The extra brake on the gondola allowed the gondola to invert. 7 Waikiki Wave Superflips were produced, but sadly only one of them is known to be left operating today at a park in Tunisia named Sfaxland. 2 other well-known examples of Vekoma's Waikiki Wave Superflip are Wipeout at Dreamland in Australia and Huracan in Six Flags Mexico. They both lasted a pretty long time, but Wipeout ended up being removed after the 2018 season and Huracan after the 2019 season.
The Vekoma Canyon Trip, Waikiki Wave and Waikiki Wave Superflip have a lot of things in common. The most notable similarities are the fact that they all make really loud noises and that they were all mechanical nightmares. Hence, almost all of them got removed.
In 1993, the same year that Vekoma made their first Waikiki Wave Superflip, another Dutch manufacturer, Mondial, introduced the Rollover. This transportable ride is technically a more extreme version of the Supernova. Like the Waikiki Wave Superflip, the Rollover has brakes that allow the gondola to go upside down and flip. Originally, the gondola had 40 seats looking sideways. Unlike the Vekoma Waikiki Wave, this ride is transportable just like the Supernova.
Between 1993 and 1995, Mondial produced 5 rollovers. 4 of them were sold to European showmen and 1 of them was sold to a park, Groneland in Stockholm, Sweden.
Out of the 5 rollovers, 3 of them were converted to a new seating arrangement with the riders sitting back to back looking outwards instead of sideways. 1 of the 3 was sold to La Ronde in Canada, where it operates as Demon to this day. It sadly is the only Mondial rollover left operating.
The 2 other rollovers that had the gondola conversion were painted with an identical color scheme as Demon, but they were never sold. They still sit at the Mondial factory to this day and they are up for sale.
From here on out, information becomes very scarce on these rides. Sometime in the 1990s, Soriani and Moser introduced the Loop on Top and Super Loop on Top. These 2 rides were very similar, with the Loop on Top being more like a Huss Topspin with no bending arms. Accordingly, it was covered in the second episode of Flat Ride of the Week. The Super Loop on top featured 2 bending arms. Unfortunately, information on these rides is again hard to find, but from what we could tell, the ride could be manufactured with 1 or 2 arms being able to bend, and the choice was up to the buyer. These rides proved quite successful in the 1990s, but by 2001, these rides had been discontinued.
An example of a super loop on top is the Vortigo at Etnaland in Italy. This ride is formerly known as Superman at Wiener Brother, where it actually replaced a normal Moser loop on top.
The Moser Rides Maverick is one of only 3 rides of this design that is still in production. The Maverick is essentially a smaller version of the loop on top. Like the loop on top, Maverick comes in multiple versions. It can be bought with 2 non-bending arms, or 1 non-bending arm and 1 bending arm. It has various gondola options, all using standard sit-down seating. The gondola comes in both single and double row versions, seating between 20 and 40 riders per cycle, depending on the gondola the buyer decides to go with. These rides have become very popular with smaller parks all around the world, with one of the most well-known examples, in the US anyway, being Twister at Lake Winnie. Zamperla apparently worked with Moser on the Super Loop on top, though details on this are very hard to find. Out of this partnership, Zamperla introduced the Windshear in the 1990s. Much like the Super Loop on top, this ride was available in 2 versions, with 2 bending arms or just 1. These days, only the single bending arm design is still in production. Unlike the Moser Rides version, all of these rides featured suspended gondolas, meaning the rider's feet are left hanging freely during the ride. The ride features 3 gondola options, a 22-rider version, 36-rider version, and a 40-rider version. It's available in both park and transportable models. This ride has become very popular in Asia, however very few have been installed in the West.
KMG's competition to this type of ride is named Discovery. It's a lot smaller than the other models of this type of ride, fitting on just 1 trailer. The gondola fits 20 people, however the prototype, which debuted in 1993, only had 18 seats to make place for a diesel engine. 4 Discoveries were sold to European showmen, and 3 of them are still traveling in France, Germany and Switzerland. And in 2015, KMG introduced a modernized version of the Discovery. The most notable difference is that the gondola is now floorless and it has different restraints. In 2015, KMG sold 2 of the second generation Discoveries, with 1 traveling in Germany and 1 in Australia.
The Scrambler was invented by Richard Hillman Harris of Georgia. The first ever Scrambler was located at the Lakewood Fairgrounds in 1938. Harris built and sold 2 more of his Scramblers around 1940. In 1941, he obtained a patent for the design of the Scrambler. Moving forward a bit, in 1954, the Eli Bridge Company obtained this patent from Richard and started producing hundreds of Scramblers. The majority of existing Scramblers were made by the Eli Bridge Company. The Scrambler featured 3 sweep arms connected to 4 rotating arms with rider capsules attached. The main sweep arms can spin at a speed of up to 11 revolutions per minute. The ride can be driven by a single 10 horsepower electric or gasoline motor. The first Eli Bridge Scrambler opened at Funland Park in Miami in 1955, and soon the model became extremely popular, with Eli Bridge Company receiving over 250 orders in 1956. However, they were only able to fill 25 of these orders due to limited plant capacity. Eli Bridge continued to expand their production of Scramblers and eventually was able to meet demand. They still produce 4 different models of Scramblers, with the main difference between them being the decorations and lighting, as well as the portability of the Scrambler. They also make a mini Scrambler, which is just a slower and smaller version of the regular Scrambler. It actually has the same capacity as a regular Scrambler at 36 riders per cycle. Eli Bridge Scramblers can be found at just about every major US parks, with over 200 operating worldwide. But a few of the most notable installations are Scrambler at Cedar Point, Centrifuge at Casino Pier. Now this is a rare breed of Scrambler. This is actually an indoor Scrambler. It has music as well as special effects that really add to the ride. There's also Astrosphere at Funtown Splashtown, USA. This is probably one of the best US flat rides out there. It has some of the best effects and music put together into an incredible experience. Although it's definitely not the fastest Scrambler out there, I definitely highly recommend watching a POV or visiting the park to experience this attraction. Eli Bridge continues to sell Scramblers today, but a number of competing rides have emerged over the years, though none have proven to be as popular as the Eli Bridge Scrambler. Outside of the US, Scramblers never really caught on, that is with the exception of the UK. In the 1950s, when the Scrambler was just first taking off in America, one Eli Bridge Scrambler made its way to the UK, and just like in the US, it quickly became extremely popular. However, due to the high demand and import costs, UK showmen began creating their own versions of Scramblers, and thus the Twist was born. These rides were Scrambler rides, but with added floors, lights, and other theatrical elements that were essential to any European ride. With the popularity of the Twist, many UK companies formed to start producing them, such as PWS Rides, who still makes Twists today. Seeing the rise in popularity of the Twist, American manufacturer Wisdom Rides introduced the Sizzler in 1973. The original Sizzler was basically a more modern version of the Scrambler, with a fiberglass rider capsule compared to the steel one on the Eli Bridge model, as well as thicker sweep arms that allowed for more lights and decoration to be added. Like the original Scrambler, the Sizzler does not come standard with a floor. The Sizzler has proved to be extremely popular, especially the traveling model. Wisdom even made an upgraded version with a floor, backdrop, and a more intense cycle, named the Super Sizzler. This model sadly suffered from a number of accidents, including rider ejections, that caused Wisdom to discontinue the model and recommend seatbelts be installed on all remaining Super Sizzlers. All Sizzlers also feature smaller rider capsules than the Scrambler, allowing only 2 adults per capsule compared to the Eli Bridge model that can allow up to 3. This lower capacity but better visual appeal is what made the Sizzler so unpopular with permanent parks and so popular with traveling fairs. Much like the Eli Bridge Scrambler, Wisdom Rides also made a family version of the Sizzler. This is just a smaller version of the regular Sizzler, except it does not have the upper part of the sweep arm, unlike the Eli Bridge version. Many Wisdom Rides Sizzlers are still in operation. Several other variations of the Scrambler have been made over the years, with one of the most interesting being the ARM UK ride named the Lifting Twister. This is a Sizzler type ride with the ability to lift up about 2 meters into the air. Unlike other Scrambler rides, it also has independent control over the speed of the sweep arms as well as the spinning arms, allowing for a more intense ride. Only one of these rides has been made, and it's currently traveling in the UK. I have been on more Eli Bridge Scramblers than I can count. They're at pretty much every park over here, so I've been on so many of them, going back as far as I can remember. Most of them have about the same ride experience, though some of them do run at different speeds. They all start out slowly spinning, and then gradually work their way up to a speed around 11 revolutions per minute. Of course, that's assuming it's run at full speed. Once at full speed, you'll feel some great lateral Gs and feel like you're being flung around the ride area. You'll also experience several near-miss moments with some of the other rider capsules. Some Eli Bridge Scramblers still use their original manual control. This consists of a lever that the operator moves forward or backwards to directly control the speed of the ride. Some examples of Scramblers still set up like this are the Scrambler at Waldameer and Indiana Beach. A lot more Scramblers, though, have been upgraded to modern PLC-based control systems. Some examples of these are the Scrambler at Cedar Point and the Scrambler at Kings Island. I have ridden a traveling Sizzler that was owned by Bates Bros Amusements of Ohio, and it's quite a bit different as far as the ride experience goes compared to a Scrambler, though when you look at it off-ride, it looks almost the same. I thought it was definitely a lot more intense than the Eli Bridge Scramblers. You definitely pull a lot more lateral Gs, and overall I thought it was definitely a bit better of a ride and definitely a lot more thrilling than your standard Scrambler. It also helps that the ride was owned by Bates Bros Amusements of Ohio, which is known for taking great care of their rides, and this ride is absolutely no exception. It's in a fantastic shape, and that really added to the whole experience. All the lights were working, and it just made it a very good ride and probably the best Scrambler type ride that I've been on so far. The whip was invented by William F. Mangles in 1914. The first whip opened at Luna Park, New York, and it was a huge success. It used several rider cars with caster-style wheels attached to a cable. This cable was wound around 2 wooden drums at opposite ends of the ride. One of the drums is powered by an electric, gasoline, or steam motor. This pulls the cars along the track at a moderate speed. However, once the cars reach the turns of the oval, they are accelerated and flung outwards. The attached cars have a mechanism that allows them to swing out and back during these moments of high lateral Gs, much like a tilt-a-whirl. The original oval-shaped whip was extremely popular. It was advertised as the world's first traveling ride due to its easy portability, though this claim is disputed. The ride could be made with 8, 10, 12, or 16 cars, depending on the desired capacity. The ride continues to be popular today, with many spin-offs of the design still in production and many originals still in operation. The ride remained in production nearly unchanged from its original design through the 1970s. In the mid-1970s, William F. Mangel's company went bankrupt and the design for the whip was sold to Sellner Manufacturing, known for being the main producer of the Tilt-A-Whirl. Sellner briefly offered whip rides before themselves going out of business in early 2011. Now Larson International, who acquired Sellner, owns the design of the whip, but they do not offer whip rides currently. Some operating examples of original whip rides are Whip at Kennywood. This is Kennywood's oldest operating ride. It opened back in 1919 and was upgraded from 12 to 16 cars in 1926. There's also Whip at Hershey Park. Now this whip has been upgraded to new cars made either by Larson or Sellner. It's unclear when this upgrade took place. And then there's Whip at Dorney Park. This ride was originally manufactured in 1918, making this one of the oldest still operating rides in the United States. It remains nearly unchanged from its original design today, though it is in very good shape, as most parks, including Dorney, have recognized the historical value of these whip rides and are doing a really good job maintaining them. Several more whip rides do remain operating, both traveling and permanent, across all of North America and Europe, though most remaining whips are concentrated in the Northeast United States. Following the success of the whip, many different manufacturers came up with different rides based on the original concept. After World War II, many of these designs became mainstream and started appearing at parks and fairgrounds around the world. Probably the most popular competition to the whip is the Roto-Whip, sometimes called a skid or a swing mill. This took the concept of the whip and made it more compact. Instead of an oval, the cars now traversed a circle. This reduced the size and cost of the ride, but also decreased the thrill. To compensate for this, several Roto-Whips added a second ring inside the main rotating ring that was connected directly to each car. This ring was off-center, so when the cars traversed a specific section of the track, they would be flung outwards, sort of like a traditional whip ride. These rides were made by several manufacturers and a lot still operate today, though the Roto-Whip is a lot more popular in Europe compared to the US. One of the most well-known Roto-Whips is Lightning Skid, owned by the Carter Steam Fair. This ride was originally made in 1965 by Hayes Fabrication. This ride was restored completely to its original state. It's very impressive looking, and if you ever get the chance to ride it, you definitely should. It's very rare and in fantastic shape for a ride of its age. While the original whip and Roto-Whip are no longer in production, and they are dwindling in numbers, the same cannot be said for the kiddie version of the ride. The William F. Mangel's company introduced a kiddie version of the whip and Roto-Whip, and both have become extremely popular, with more kiddie versions of both rides operating today than normal versions. Kings Island, for example, has a kiddie whip, and Cedar Point has a kiddie Roto-Whip. Zamperla Rides of Italy is the only manufacturer still selling a whip-type ride today. Named the Speedway, this is also a children's ride. It works a lot like the original kiddie whips, but the cars cannot swing out as far as they can on a Mangel's kiddie whip. I have operated one of these rides, and it has its own challenges. I've operated Peanuts 500 at Cedar Point, which is one of these rides. I discussed the operation of this ride as well as a lot more details about these rides back in episode 10 of Flat Ride of the Week. Zamperla also makes the Flying Tigers, which is basically a suspended version of the Speedway. While I've never personally operated a full-size whip, we have John here from Kennywood who has.
Hello, thanks for having me. So I was hired for Kennywood for the 2019 season, and I was put on the Exterminator crew, which the Exterminator crew consisted of the Exterminator, which was an indoor spinning wild mouse, and it also had the whip on it, which is how I got intertwined with it. So pretty much so I've been operating the ride for 3 years now. Closed up my third summer back in August, and so I know a lot about the ride, to say the least. So day at the whip, it would start out, you'd go outside and there'd be these covers on the cars, these big black covers. You had to put them over it to protect the ride overnight from the rain and everything else. It'd start out by taking these covers, you have to put them in 2 trash bins on either side of the platform. And then after you put the covers away, you turn on the power to the ride, and then it's pretty simple. You go through a simple checklist, making sure you did all your test runs, maintenance signed off the ride, you cleaned everything. Do your test runs, you're pretty much ready to open for the public. It's very simple to open. The ride itself is very simple to operate. It's pretty much consists of 2 buttons, a start and a stop. The original trolley crank from 1919, which you mainly use to start up the ride. And a timer was actually added to cut the power, so each cycle was the same length of time. So there is a height restriction on the ride. It is 46 inches. However, if you're able to walk, you can ride with a responsible adult. You only have to be 46 inches to ride alone without an adult. You could have up to 2 adults in a car and then 3 if there's children. You can't have 3 adults in the car though. And trust me, I've had people that tried and I'd have to tell them to separate. So capacity on the ride, we were actually, over the 2021 season, we actually had to keep track of capacity for a month. The average capacity for the whip was around 300 people per hour. And in that hour, we usually ran around 10 cycles. Theoretically, you could fit 48 people in a ride cycle. That's if you had 2 adults and 1 kid, or just 3 people in general in every single car. But usually it was around 30 people per cycle. The restraints on the ride, extremely simple, bare bones. It's literally just a silver bar that just comes down. It doesn't lock or anything. It just stays in place. But you really don't need it to lock on this ride because all the forces in the ride are push you back into your seat. So there's no case where you'd be pushed forward out of the ride. That just would never happen. It's physically impossible.
Sort of reminds me of a tilt-a-whirl in that sense, which is a ride I'm very familiar with.
So a couple annoyances with the ride, nothing too crazy, but because it does not have a cover in Lost Kennywood, during midday, that sun just comes down onto that ride, and with that black track, all that heat just gets absorbed and just stays there. So it is extremely hot and kind of grueling in the sun middle of the day to work that ride. If you do not have water, you're definitely going to be passing out or something. I remember during my first season, I forgot my water bottle inside the Exterminator. I came out there. I thought I would be fine. 5 minutes in, I was telling them to run it out. It was pretty tough. And then the other annoyance with it is I mentioned the whip covers to open the ride. Well, at the end of the day, to close the ride, you have to put those covers back on. Just those covers were just had all kinds of oil and grease on it just from the track and the ride itself. So putting them back on, your hands would just be black with grease and oil by the time you're done with it. If you had to close the ride every night, your hands would be like that. You'd have to go and clean them off for like 5 minutes, just scrubbing, which that was always annoying. But what can you do? It's an old ride. It's greasy. So to close the whip, you actually had to park it in a specific spot because on the turntable farthest away from the Exterminator, there's actually a hatch on it. So you'd have to take off the hatch, which would just be a hole to the bottom of the ground. You'd have to run the ride. So you position this hatch over a sort of lever that's actually inside, underneath the whip. You have to position it right under the hatch, but it would take you a couple times because all the momentum to stop the ride right where it needs to be. Once you get that hatch over this lever, you'd have to crank this lever underneath the ride 3 times. And what that was doing was actually turning that wheel backwards to take the tension off the chain. That way, you wouldn't wear the chain away too quickly. And after that, like I said, you have to put the covers back on, lock off the power, and that'd be it for the night. Which one of the reasons I think you can't, there's a minimum height restriction. I'm just kind of inferring this, but if you had a really light kid, that car would be swinging around way more, and you'd be, with less weight, that kid would be thrown around if he was by himself, which is why you need to have parents in there. Make sure, he doesn't get thrown around too much.
Yeah, that would make sense because those cars are pretty big. I have never ridden one. I've seen plenty of them. I'm kicking myself for never riding one because I've seen it at Kennywood and all these other PA parks so many times, but I never got just rode one.
Yeah.
But that'll definitely change this next coming season.
Because it is a good ride the whole family can enjoy. As you're saying, it's a tame ride, but at the same time, there is a bit of a thrill and adrenaline rush whenever you get into that whip and that car swings around. I feel like it's definitely a step above something like a Scrambler,
Mm-hmm. Hey, well, sounds really interesting. I definitely need to go and ride one. That goes for anyone else watching. If you do see a whip, they are dwindling in their numbers. So if you do find one, absolutely go for it and ride it. They seem like incredible rides, and they're getting rarer every day.
The Flipper made its debut in 1987 on the German fair circuit. The Flipper consists of a round plate with 12 free spinning gondolas on it. Each gondola fits 4 people, making the capacity 48 riders per cycle. The plate can lift up to 50 degrees and it can spin in both directions. Huss produced around 20 flippers, with the last one leaving the factory in the late 90s. The Flipper was and still is popular on European fairs, but also some parks like PortAventura in Spain and Heide Park in Germany bought a Huss Flipper. Sadly, the one at PortAventura is run extremely slow, almost to the point where there is no thrill at all, and the ride is pretty much useless. And the one at Heide Park has sadly been sold to Iraq now.
There are currently 3 Huss flippers traveling in the US. Huss later made a version of the flipper named the Crazy Pineapple. The Crazy Pineapple has 6 gondolas, and unlike the flipper, the gondolas are controlled by a motor, and the plate does not tilt, making it a more family-oriented ride. Only 3 of them are sold. Unlike the flipper, this ride was only available as a permanent version. The Speedy is also somewhat similar to a flipper. The base of the ride can kind of be compared to that of a Trabant ride. However, unlike a Trabant, it does not lift. The plate has 10 gondolas on it, which were originally free spinning, but on later models were changed to being controlled by a motor.
And a big competition to the Huss flipper was the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl was manufactured by the British company ARM Rides and Italian company SDC. It does pretty much the same thing as a flipper, but it's smaller in size and the gondolas are flat on the plate, unlike on the flipper where they are slightly tilted. The Super Bowl was made in various sizes from 6 up to 11 gondolas. Most models were sold with 10 gondolas. Most of them were made in the early 90s when the Huss flipper was also popular. There are still multiple ARM Super Bowls traveling in the UK and also one in the US, and there's also still SDC Super Bowls traveling in Europe.
In 1997, ARM made a version of the Super Bowl with rollover gondolas. Apparently the experience was very uncomfortable, so they changed the design of the gondola 2 years later. It now has floorless gondolas and remains the only ride of this type with these type of gondolas.
SDC also made a version of the Super Bowl where the whole structure rotates. At least 2 of them were built and none of them are known to be left operating. This ride was pretty much like a Trabant or Hully Gully ride, whatever you want to call it, but instead of the usual sideways facing gondolas, there was a Super Bowl plate.
And while flipper rides never really took off in the US like they did in Europe, the US does have a ride that is somewhat similar. Frank Hubert's company, known for their classic rides like the Paratrooper and Roundup, introduced the Tip Top sometime between 1939 and 1974. It's unclear the exact year that it was introduced. The ride consists of 8 to 12 independently spinning tubs that spin on a plate, kind of like the much newer flipper. The whole plate is then popped into the air a few feet or about a meter using a blast of compressed air. The riders also have a plate in the ride vehicle that allows them to spin their car. This leads to a dizzying and airtime-filled experience that is very well loved. These rides peaked in their popularity in the 1970s, and since then they have become harder and harder to find. Originally, you could find them at almost every major park out there, as well as many fairgrounds. Today, some of the most well-known examples are the Tip Top at Stricker's Grove near Cincinnati, Ohio. This one is still in operation, however, due to that park's limited operation, you can only ride it a few specific days out of the year. Bates Bros of Ohio also has a traveling Tip Top. Being a Bates Bros ride, this ride is in fantastic shape. It travels to various Bates Bros shows, including the IX Indoor Amusement Park. I have seen it, but sadly I did not ride it. However, next time I get the chance to, I do plan on riding it because this ride is extremely rare, and it looks really fun. So now moving on to the ride experience of some of the larger rides.
So I have personally been on 3 Huss flipper and 1 knockoff flipper, which was manufactured in Spain. The Huss ones were all 3 really great. The forces on them they can be really insane. Like, I cracked my back on one of them. It was really insane. And just the lights on these things, they're just so beautiful. The design, most of them have like really nice backdrops, which were hand painted back in the 90s. Really beautiful stuff. But sadly, there's also some that are not that beautiful anymore. But still, the ones we have traveling here in Europe, most of them are really beautiful. And the knockoff one, it was actually pretty good. Like, it had a very similar sensation as a Huss one. It just didn't have that really insane force. But it was pretty comfortable to ride, and it was still a very fun and kind of intense ride. So flip rides, I really love them. You can give a great show with them. They look great, they are amazing to ride. and it can just be a really intense experience.
The Early Lupoplane was invented in 1933 by Lee Early, owner of the Early Aircraft Company. The ride was designed to be a perfect high-thrill ride that was also simple to transport. Traveling fairground rides were becoming increasingly popular at this time, and Early wanted to make a ride that was both thrilling and easily transportable. The Lupoplane consisted of two identical arms with rider capsules on one end and a counterweight on the other. These identical arms were attached to a central arm that contained two drive shafts that were set up in such a way that the identical arms would spin in opposite directions. These drive shafts could be powered by a gasoline tractor engine or an electric motor. The two symmetrical arms rotating in opposite directions allowed the ride to be transported on one trailer, as the counter rotation of the arms cancels out most of the swing that would otherwise have to be accounted for by a complex support system on the ground. This ride was invented before the over-the-shoulder restraint, so the restraint system consisted of a locking door and a single-position lap bar. These rides can seat up to 8 riders per cycle. The Lupoplane became very popular, with parks and showmen buying up hundreds of them. Many can still be found operating today, such as the Lupoplane at Keansburg Amusement Park in New Jersey. With the popularity of other inverting rides such as the Larson Superloop and the Huss Ranger, which was also inspired by the Lupoplane at an all-time high, Italian company Fabri Group, which included Sartori and many other manufacturers, created the Kamikaze in 1984. Inspired by the Lupoplane, the Kamikaze modernized the design while increasing the safety, capacity, and visual appeal. The ride featured two 16-person ride vehicles that used over-the-shoulder restraints, a lap bar, and a cage around the riders to keep riders from breaking clearances. The original Kamikaze used a single 75-horsepower electric motor connected to a drive shaft that ran up the ride tower and to each arm. While the ride had counterweights attached to each arm, they were not relied on very heavily, causing the ride to have to swing back and forth to build up speed, leading to a more intense ride overall. Newer versions of the ride use larger counterweights and provide a less intense cycle. The ride was controlled directly by the operator, leading to an infinite number of different cycles. It could be transported on just one trailer due to its compact design. The original Kamikaze was hugely popular, with over 150 being made before Fabri Group split up. Fabri Group also introduced the Kamikaze 2 in the late 1980s or early 90s. This ride removed the floor of the original Kamikaze and half of the rider cage. To ensure riders' legs did not break clearance and hit the loading platform, the ride featured a sort of step ladder built into the rider vehicle that allowed riders to step up and into their seats. The ride retained the half-cage design on the main support side of the ride so that riders could not reach out and break clearance. Fabri Group also made a ride known as the Fabri Cataclysm and Giant Cataclysm. This was a floorless Kamikaze, but with a lifting center arm rather than a stepladder. Unlike all other Kamikaze rides before it, the main tower could rotate 360 degrees. The Giant Cataclysm featured riders seated in rows of 4, allowing for a higher capacity. This model became especially popular with parks.
There used to be a lot of Kamikazes traveling all over Europe, but sadly they are quite hard to find today.
Several Fabri Kamikazes remain operating with many showmen across the United States. They're one of the few flat rides that's made in Europe that's actually more popular over here in the States. Many other manufacturers have created their own version of the Fabri Kamikaze. It would be impossible to name every one in this video, but some of the most notable versions are the ARM UK Skymaster, which was introduced in 1990. This ride is now discontinued. However, it was nearly identical to the Fabri version. Only one remains operating, and it's owned by the Hammond family and traveling in the UK.
And then the Vekoma and Mondial Skyflyer, which was introduced in 1984. This ride is also now discontinued. This ride was also nearly identical to the Fabri and Sartori Kamikaze, but the interesting part is that it uses lap bars and no over-the-shoulder restraints like most Kamikaze rides. A few remain operating, including one at Legendia in Poland. Mondial also introduced another special version of the Skyflyer named the Tornado. It was introduced in 1989. It was very different from the standard Kamikaze as the arms could operate separately from each other. Sadly, this unique ride ended up in Eastern Europe and does not operate anymore.
Zamperla introduced the Hawk quite a bit later than a lot of the rides we mentioned before. This was designed as a more park-friendly version of the Kamikaze. It is only available as a permanent version. It can be made with 1 or 2 arms, with riders seated in rows of 3, giving it a capacity up to 48 riders per cycle. The ride featured floorless gondolas, making the ride feel much more modern and free. In order to allow for the floorless gondolas, a moving floor was introduced with these ride models that moves away from the gondolas before the start of the ride. Several of these rides have been made, with examples such as Aero 360 at Kennywood and Meteor at Dorney Park. There's also the ARM USA Typhoon, not to be confused with the ARM UK ride. This ride was introduced much more recently. The ARM USA Typhoon is a modern take on the classic Kamikaze, still transportable and seating the classic 32 riders per cycle. This ride seats riders in rows of 2 with floorless gondolas. To allow for this, the floor slides outwards away from the ride prior to the start of the ride cycle. Due to the ride's small size compared to the non-transportable Zamperla Hawk, this keeps a part of the rider cage design on the side of the ride that passes the main tower, which allows the ride to pass clearance. The Typhoon has proved very popular in the US, with several showmen and parks buying them. One of the best examples is the Typhoon at Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk. As mentioned before, many other ride manufacturers have made rides of this design, and undoubtedly more will be made in the future. After the Fabri Group split up and Fabri and Sartori became separate companies, they both began creating their own variations on the original design. Fabri now produces a ride called the Turbo 360. This ride is essentially a modernized version of the Kamikaze and Cataclysm. It can be made in a 16 or 32 rider version. It features floorless gondolas with a partial cage on the support arm side of the ride. Instead of a moving floor, this ride's support arm raises a few meters into the air before the ride cycle begins to allow the ride to pass clearance, much like the Cataclysm. Sartori, on the other hand, played it safe. They produced what is essentially the standard Kamikaze, pretty much unchanged since the 1980s. They have sold several to showmen in South America. Now moving on a bit, no major accidents have occurred on Kamikaze rides as a result of mechanical failure. The only injuries, accidents, or deaths have been caused by rider negligence or operator error. Now Kamikaze rides are still pretty common on the US fair circuit, but as mentioned before, they are getting quite rare in Europe, although they used to be just as common over there. Since most Kamikaze rides are controlled directly by the operator, some have very intense ride cycles, though you will have to get lucky to find a ride that's still operated like that today. I have not personally been on a Kamikaze, neither has Alex, but we've both seen them. They just never really appealed to me much, but I can tell you for sure that if I do see one again, I'll definitely be taking a ride, just so I can say I've experienced it. The Roundup was invented by Frank Hubetz and Company in 1954. The ride featured a rotating disc powered by 2 electric motors connected to the disc with car tires. The ride has between 30 and 36 independent standing seats for riders. The disc is connected to a central lifting arm that can lift the entire ride to over a 50-degree angle. Though to save on maintenance costs, most Roundups do not go this high, and instead average about a 45-degree tilt. The Roundup became a huge success nearly instantly. With the high demand, Hubetz decided to license the design of the Roundup to several manufacturers in Europe and Australia, focusing on domestic orders only. Many European manufacturers would eventually create Roundups, and we'll get to those in a moment. With the popularity of the Roundup growing, not just with traveling fairs, but also with parks, Hubetz introduced the Super Roundup sometime in the 1960s or early 70s. This was a larger version of the Roundup with 42 seats, ideal for parks, but still transportable. Both models proved to be very popular, with over 70 Hubetz Roundup rides being produced for the United States. Today, many can still be found operating. One operating example of an original Roundup is Riddle Me This at Six Flags America. This ride does not tilt as much as some of the other original Roundups, but it still has kind of a nice facade around it and fits into its whole area a lot better than you might expect for a traveling ride. Much more Super Roundups remain operating, with one example being Fantasy Fling at Great Adventure, Six Flags Great Adventure. This ride has been relocated and rethemed several times throughout the park, and this really showcases the Super Roundup's portability and ability to just kind of fit into any area of a park. There's also Electric Rainbow at Stricker's Grove. This is probably one of the most pristine Super Roundups in operation, For its age, it's in fantastic shape and runs much like all Roundups did back in the 1970s. Frank Hubet's company stopped manufacturing rides in 1992. After this point, several other ride manufacturers began creating their version of the Roundup, with one of the most prominent being the now-defunct Dartron. Dartron created their first Roundup-inspired ride around or before 1995, named the Zendar. This ride was very different and much more visually appealing than the Roundup. This ride featured an extra movement compared to the standard Roundup. The ride was able to lift up on the main lifting arm, but the rider plate would remain horizontal. Once at full height, the ride would move the rider plate into alignment with the main lifting arm. This gave riders a much more extreme experience by allowing them to encounter different amounts of centrifugal force. At least 5 of these rides were produced, but sadly none are known to be operating today. The model was discontinued sometime before Dartron closed. Dartron also introduced the Zero Gravity in 2003. This was a modernized version of the Roundup with 33 passenger seating. These rides feature a direct motor drive rather than car tires. They also come with a modernized light display. These rides have proven to be very popular, with several traveling showmen owning them, including Bates Bros of Ohio. Several parks have also bought Zero Gravity rides, such as Holiday World. Their ride is named Revolution and has proven to be very popular as it's located near the exit to their Rapids ride, serving as a way for riders to dry off after riding the Rapids. After Dartron closed, their assets were bought by Batak Enterprises, who still makes the ride today. Batak also supplies parts for Hubert's and Dartron versions of the ride.
The Roundup was also popular in Europe. As mentioned before, multiple manufacturers built Roundups under license from Hubert. Most of the European Roundups were made by German manufacturers Klaus and Veets in the 50s, 60s and 70s. There are still some Roundups traveling in Europe. In 1978, Huss made some kind of stand-up enterprise, the UFO, where you stand up in cages without any restraints facing to the middle of the ride. It's somewhat similar to a Roundup, but it goes completely vertical and it's a lot bigger. The ride is approximately 65 feet or 20 meters tall. It has 12 gondolas with 4 people per gondola, so it has a capacity of 48 riders per cycle. It uses the same lifting mechanism and floor structure as the Huss Enterprise. It was available as both transportable and park version and has been discontinued for a long time. Huss made at least 11 UFOs with 4 remaining in operation. 2 park versions at Canada's Wonderland and Gold Reef City in South Africa, and 2 traveling units in France and Germany. And in 1985, Huss made another ride somewhat relatable to a Roundup named the Disco Round. In this ride there are 20 gondolas that each seat 2 people, making for a capacity of 40 riders per cycle. The whole structure can rotate up to 24 revolutions per minute and tilts to 30 degrees. This tilt allows the gondolas to get shot up and down by gravity. There are also pneumatic impulse generators under each gondola, allowing for a controlled sequence. The ride was originally completely enclosed. Huss made at least 6 disco rounds and 3 of them are left operating. 2 in parks in Saudi Arabia and Belarus, and 1 is still traveling in Germany. This disco round was completely modified in 2015 and has the roof and walls removed, making for an open-air experience.
Alright, moving on a little bit, we're going to now move into the operation of the Roundup. Here we have Chase, who operated the Roundup at Six Flags America back in 2018.
The cycle of a Roundup is pretty straightforward, even as far as manual flat rides are concerned. All you do is load all your riders in, make sure that they all have a little strap in front of them. That was probably just a Six Flags thing, to be completely honest with you.
Don't know if that was standard.
I'm not convinced that the original models actually featured any form of redundant restraint, but regardless, as once those are all secure, you head back to the panel. The panel features a couple of switches, a couple of lights. What these switches are going to do, these switches are going to control the direction of the drive tires that are responsible for spinning the main body of the Roundup, and they're also going to be responsible for raising and lowering the ride unit to its maximum tilt and all the way back to the ground after the cycle is over. The lights that I mentioned are also fairly straightforward. They'll let you know if the ride has any faults. They'll let you know if the ride needs any form of attention, if like a gate isn't closed properly, because those gates had proximity switches on them at the time I worked it. And in addition, all the manual functions of that ride are going to be guided by these lights. So when you start the cycle, you're going to begin by switching the drive tires on. It will start spinning the ride counterclockwise, clockwise, whichever direction you choose.
Oh,
Then,
so you can choose.
Yes, you can. You can choose which direction those drive tires go. So you're going to turn it on. It's going to get up to full speed. A light's going to turn on that will indicate that the unit has reached full operating speed. Once that full operating speed has been reached, that's when the ride is designed to begin lifting up into the air. You'll use the second switch. Hold that until it raises all the way. You'll get another light that indicates that the ride is at its highest raised position. This is kind of similar to an Enterprise where it builds up speed and then raises. The reason it does that is because obviously the ride is structured similarly to something like a rotor. You don't want people slowly looking face down when the original versions of this ride didn't have any form of restraint, let alone a single strap like the Six Flags version has. Then you'll raise it all the way up. Once it's moving all the way, the ride will continue moving at full speed for around a minute. Then, similar to many other flat rides, a light's going to come on indicating that the cycle is over. Then, keeping the ride at full speed, lower it all the way back down to the ground, and then start braking it. You don't hold to brake it, however what you do, you pulse the brakes to create a smooth stop and prevent any damage from being dealt to the tires. So you'll hold the brakes on for around 2 seconds, then let it go for 4, and pulse it slowly until the ride comes to a complete stop over and over and over. Then you'll go unlock the gates. There's 2 gates on each ride unit that you can unlock from inside and from outside so that the ride operator is able to access the unit when they need, and then unload all of your riders. As far as quirks that this type of ride has, the most notable thing about operating this ride is that if you emergency stop the ride, it will cut all power, pretty straightforward. So the unit will come to a stop, it will slowly stop spinning. The arm will stay exactly where you left it. You don't have power to the motor that raises and lowers it. So if you are at a full tilt, 50, 55 degrees even, and you are spinning and then you emergency stop the ride, your unit's going to come to a stop on its side.
That would be fun for all the riders, right?
Oh yeah. That's what the strap is there for, I'm sure.
Honestly, yeah, probably. I'm sure it's happened before.
I wouldn't be surprised.
KMG introduced the Inversion in 2008. You could describe the Inversion as an inverting version of the KMG Freakout, with 3 gondolas similar to what you can find on a KMG Speed, making a capacity of 12 riders per cycle. The gondolas have the ability to flip freely, but when properly operated, they only do that if the arm is swinging under 90 degrees. For the rest of the cycle, the gondolas are locked. The ride is 24 meters or 79 feet tall, only 3 meters or 10 feet taller than the Freakout. The Inversion fits on just 1 trailer and takes 4 hours to set up with 2 persons. The prototype Inversion, named Dominator, made its debut on the Dutch Fair circuit in July 2008 at the Fair of Tilburg. The model proved to be very popular, with 28 units sold all around the world. It is available as both traveling and park version, but most units are sold as traveling version.
Kissel Entertainment of the US owns a KMG Inversion 12. It was originally bought by PBJ Happy Day Shows in 2009 and was the first Inversion to come to the US. It was sold to Kissel Entertainment sometime around 2017. PBJ Happy Day Shows bought a new Inversion 12 around 2014 and sold their old one to Kissel. It has been traveling with them since and has been to many shows such as the Bluegrass Fair and the Kentucky State Fair. Being a Kissel ride, it is in great shape. However, in the last 2 years, it has seemingly stopped unlocking its gondolas, making for a much less intense cycle. It's hoped that the ride still has the ability to unlock this feature, and it's not been permanently disabled. Overall, there are 28 KMG Inversions operating, with 12 currently traveling in the US. Interestingly, the first half of KMG Inversions produced ended up mostly in Europe, while the second and more recent half of Inversions made have mostly gone to the US.
KMG introduced the Inversion 24 in 2016. This enormous 62 meter or 203 feet tall ride is the bigger version of the Inversion with double the capacity, 24 riders per cycle, seated in 3 8-person gondolas. Just like the original Inversion 12, the gondolas have the ability to unlock when the arm is swinging under 90 degrees. It uses supports very similar to what KMG used before on their XXL. The Inversion 24 fits on 4 trailers and takes 7 to 8 hours to set up with 5 persons. The ride is available as both transportable and park version, but sadly only one unit has been sold yet, which is a traveling model named Infinity, traveling on the German and Dutch fair circuit with showman Hoefnagels. This prototype made its debut at the fair in Pforzheim in Germany in June 2016.
Technical Park introduced the LoopFighter in 2010 as competition to the KMG Inversion. It was a combination of their earlier Street Fighter Revolution with the ride vehicles from their Pegasus ride. The first model debuted on the Spanish fair circuit that same year. Like the Inversion, this was a spinning pendulum-style ride with a counterweight to allow the entire arm to flip. The seats were similar in concept to the Inversion, being able to be unlocked and relocked by the operator. However, the design of the seats were very different, being based off of the Technical Park Pegasus ride. These seats are set up facing outwards from the center with 4 riders per ride vehicle and 4 ride vehicles in total, making for a capacity of 16 riders per cycle. The arm swings up to a height of 24 meters or 78 feet, making it very visually impressive. The ride is also able to be transported on just one trailer, much like the Inversion 12, making it very popular not just in Europe but also in the US, where transportability is a bigger concern. The ride has a height requirement of 140 centimeters or 55 inches. One example of this ride was the LoopFighter at Niagara Amusement Park, otherwise known as Fantasy Island, New York. This was one of the largest attractions at the park when it was closed and sold to Gene Staples. It's unknown if the LoopFighter will remain open when the park reopens this year. Reithofer Shows in the US also has a traveling LoopFighter that is still traveling with them today around the US. The ride is in great shape and is sure to be a great ride.
And also in Europe there's still a lot of LoopFighters traveling, and there's also a few park installations around the world, in Mexico and Israel, for example.
Technical Park also makes a version of the LoopFighter known as the Mini LoopFighter 12. Introduced around 2013, this is a smaller version of the original LoopFighter marketed as a family ride. Interestingly, with it being marketed as a family ride, its height requirement is unchanged from the full-size LoopFighter, at 140 centimeters or 55 inches. This version of the LoopFighter is much shorter, only reaching 12 meters or 39 feet at its max height, exactly half of the normal LoopFighter. It also has one less ride vehicle, making for a capacity of 12 riders per cycle. Unlike the larger LoopFighter, this model is only available with an automatic cycle. Only a few mini LoopFighters have been sold, with most going to indoor parks and family entertainment centers. Fabry also made a ride called Inversion in 2010. This ride is much larger than the KMG Inversion 12 or LoopFighter, standing at over 40 meters or 131 feet tall. Like the LoopFighter, this ride has 16 seats.
Fabry sold 2 Inversions in 2010, one named Inversion XXL to Spanish showman Banyuls, who traveled with it for just one season and then sold it to Dutch showman Ortelman, who still travels with it on the Dutch and German fair circuit. It has changed a lot though. It was recently completely rethemed and renamed to Propeller, and in 2018 they removed one gondola, reducing the capacity to 12 riders per cycle. This is rumored to be because of inspection standards. The other Fabry Inversion is named New World XXL and has been traveling in France since 2010 under various owners. It's currently traveling with showman Chrisman and underwent a restyle for 2021. Unlike Propeller, this one is still running with its 4 original gondolas.
Alright, now moving on to the ride experience. Now, I have never been on one of these, however, Alex has been on multiple of these, including the LoopFighter.
I have been on at least 4 traveling LoopFighters. It was actually one of my first real inverting rides, and it's a pretty insane ride to start off with, because these things can get really intense, definitely when they release the brakes. If you're lucky, you can get some insanely good swings of the gondola, and sometimes it even like passes through the station almost upside down and you get this really forceful swing. It can be really insane, but you can also not be lucky and get like no forces at all. That has also happened. This is what makes a LoopFighter fun, in my opinion. Every cycle is different, and I really like that. You can also get some great hang time when the whole arm is swinging upside down. And yeah, because of the intensity, it's not the most comfortable ride, but it's definitely fun. I have also been on a KMG Inversion 24 Infinity, which was an insane experience. The forces you experience while going like through the station, when the whole ride like does the full loop, it's just insane. You get pushed in your seat like nothing else, and the hang time when you're up there, 62 meters in the sky, it's really insane too. However, like when they release the gondolas, you don't get that much swing, so it doesn't add that much, the swinging gondolas. But the overall ride experience is really, really great. And I have also been on both Fabry Inversions. They're both really good. However, Propeller was a little bit disappointing because it had an automatic cycle. New World is still operated manually though, and that thing is really, really insane. New World, it has such insane cycles. Really fun ride. Recommended definitely.
The Witching Waves was invented in 1907 by Theophilus Van Cannel, who is most well known for being the inventor of the revolving door. The ride consisted of a large oval track made of sheets of iron. Under these iron sheets were levers attached to a set of gears that itself were attached to a central drive shaft that was powered by an electric motor, steam engine, or combustion engine, depending on what was most convenient for the park. The design produced a sort of wave that would travel along the sheet iron. The waves were set to be larger on certain parts of the track where the owners wanted the ride vehicles to travel faster. These waves would be the primary method of propulsion for the rider vehicles. The rider vehicles themselves were small, two-person cars with a simple steering wheel and no restraints. The cars had to be pushed out of the loading area by the operator. Later versions of the Witching Waves, such as the one formerly located at Euclid Beach in Cleveland, Ohio, were made with small electric motors and a battery built into the car to reduce the amount of work operators had to do. In the original version of the ride, operators had to be stationed around the track to ensure that the vehicles did not become stuck. The idea of the ride was to quote-unquote catch a wave by shifting your weight and turning the car so that you could move as fast as possible around the track while also bumping into others. Due to the ride's design, this ride was only available as a permanent model. The Witching Waves is now seen as the first bumper car type ride, made at a time when other methods of propelling the car were not easily available. The widespread availability of powerful electric motors and the invention of the electrified grid ceiling made the Witching Waves obsolete and caused the modern Dodgem/bumper cars we see today to become mainstream. All models of the Witching Wave were removed by 1940. Due to this, footage is extremely hard to find, which is why you're seeing video clips repeating. Several Witching Waves rides were installed between 1907 and the mid-1920s. The first was installed at Luna Park, Coney Island. After it was installed, a company named Witching Waves Company was formed to install these rides at parks around the world. The company is only known to have made the Witching Waves. Witching Waves could once be found at parks all over the Western world, with some examples being located at Blackpool in England, Euclid Beach Park in Cleveland, Ohio, Paragon Park in Massachusetts, and Parasailes Park in New Jersey, but many more were made over the years. Due to the metal fatigue caused by the constant bending of the iron plates and the complex system placed under these plates, these rides were seen as mechanical nightmares. In some of the newer photos of these rides, you can see lots of scrapes and gashes in the iron plate floor. These rides were also known for producing some serious accidents and injuries. Accordingly, many were removed shortly after their novelty wore off. The Witching Waves at Euclid Beach Park, for example, opened in 1924 and closed just under 10 years later in 1933. After this ride closed, the building it was housed in along with its rider cars were reused to make a dark ride. And finally, for one of the most interesting facts we've probably ever shared on Flat Ride of the Week, Franz Paulbaum was the chief mechanic for the Witching Waves company. In late 1911, he sailed to France to install a Witching Waves ride at a park in Paris. Upon completion of the installation, the owners of the Paris park were so happy with his work that they offered to upgrade his trip back to the US by paying for a cabin for him on the Titanic. He was originally planning to return to the US on the ship SS La Provence. He accepted their offer and was unfortunately killed in the disaster.
In 1994, Dutch ride designer Van Orso designed a ride that he gave the project name of Bobo. Van Orso has made many designs which were picked up by manufacturers like Huss and Mondial, but only 3 of his designs have been realized yet. The Giant Evolution by Nautilus Inc., the Topple Tower by Huss, and the Magic Arms by Wagner Bureau, which we are going to talk about today.
Wagner Bureau is most well known for construction and engineering of bridges and stages. However, this company is not unfamiliar with the amusement industry. They had manufactured multiple double and triple Ferris wheels in the early 70s and 80s, which were sold by Intamin. Magic Arms was the first thrill ride and transportable ride they ever manufactured. Wagner Bureau shut down the amusement technology division of their company between 1998 and 2000. Wagner Bureau started with the technical development of the Magic Arms in 1995, and in March 1996, German showman Barth officially purchased the first Magic Arms, named Flying Circus. Flying Circus consisted of 3 parts: the main arm, the second arm, and the gondola. All 3 of these parts could rotate. The main arm at 8 revolutions per minute, the second arm at 9 revolutions per minute, and originally the gondola was intended to rotate at 8 revolutions per minute, but after early testing it was reduced to 6 revolutions per minute. 39 people fit on the gondola with 2 rows of outside-facing seats. The maximum height of the ride was 20 meters, which was achieved when the ride was fully upside down. Originally, the gondola was supposed to be lifted up hydraulically to get it out of the loading position. This was changed to a more simple design of retractable stairs that move out of the way before the ride starts. Flying Circus was transported on 5 trailers and took about 1.5 days to set up and roughly 10 hours to break down.
Flying Circus made its debut on the Frühjahrsband in Aachen in early 1997. Flying Circus mainly operated at fairs in Germany, but it also went to some fairs in the Netherlands, like Tilburg in 2000 and Weert in 2005. Bart actively traveled with Flying Circus from 1997 until 2008. In the summer of 2008, Flying Circus operated at the Luna Park in Palavas-les-Flots in southern France. The ride was most likely hired for this event by a different showman, since the Bart signage on top of the ride was removed when it was in France. After the summer, it returned to Germany to do a few more fairs with Bart, with its last one being the Allerheiligen Kirmes in Soest. This ended up being Flying Circus's very last fair. After the 2008 season ended, it was rumored that Flying Circus would be set up at a German amusement park named Taunus Wunderland, which is owned by showman Bart. This, however, never happened, and in 2009 the Flying Circus appeared at Vidam Park in Budapest, Hungary. The ride ended up operating in this park until the park removed almost all of its rides in late 2013. Flying Circus is said to have had its very last ride on the 30th of September in 2013. The ride was then disassembled and it is unknown what happened to it. Some parts of the ride were reused for a very different ride, a unique Hungarian knockoff breakdance. This unusual breakdance has 5 crosses which have the ability to lift up, but unlike other breakdances with this feature, they don't race all at once, but they bounce up and down with the use of an eccentric, much like a monster or polyp ride. A transport trailer of Flying Circus was used as the main trailer for this ride, and also some decoration pieces and the operator box were reused on this ride. What happened to the rest of Flying Circus is sadly unknown.
Now, while the Flying Circus never became very popular in the West, with obviously only one being produced and that ride now being completely gone, the model has caught on much more in the East, with Chinese flat ride manufacturer Nanfang making a ride called the Crazy Circus. This ride was first introduced sometime before 2015. It appears to only be available in a permanent version. Like the original, this ride has 39 seats with over-the-shoulder restraints. It reaches a max height of 20.2 meters or 66 feet, pretty much the same as the original. This is including the large lightning rod placed on the ride's main support arm. This lightning rod is a standard design on many Chinese flat rides. It uses rotating stairs to load and unload the ride. This is a standard design for a lot of Nanfang rides. Multiple have been produced, with many still operating today at Chinese parks all across mainland China. Though it's believed that none have been sold to parks outside of China, however, information is hard to find, so that could be incorrect. The ride is pretty similar to the original, although it is to be noted that the arms do appear to move a little bit slower and a little bit more sluggishly than the original, at least the original when it was still new.
Mel Park, currently known as Technical Park, was inspired by the Soriani & Moser Tornado adventure to make the Vortex. This ride was made in two versions. One of each version was made. The most notable difference between the two versions is that one has inside-facing seats and the other one has outside-facing seats.
The Vortex fits on 3 trailers, one for the main structure of the ride, one for the gondolas, and one for the scenery. It took about 1.5 days to set up and 9 hours to take down. The main structure can rotate at a maximum speed of 7 revolutions per minute, the arms at 3.7 revolutions per minute, and the gondolas at 20 revolutions per minute. The whole structure lifts up to 30 degrees to make the ride even more impressive. It fits 32 riders per cycle in 2 separate gondolas.
The first and only Vortex made with inside-facing seats was made by Mel Park and sold by Fabry. It was named after the model of the ride, Vortex, and it made its debut on the French fair circuit in 1997 under ownership of Bazin. In 2003, the Vortex was sold to another French showman named Courchinou. He also took it outside of France to multiple fairs in Belgium in 2008 and 2012, working together with Belgian showmen Vasselaerts and Heiplon. The very last fair that Vortex did in Europe was the September Fair in Hasselt in 2012.
In March of 2013, controversial American showman John Macaroni purchased the Vortex. A little fun fact is that they actually censored the backdrop when it came to the US. It originally featured topless women. When it came to the US, they painted some bikinis on them to make it more acceptable for the US. They actually did a pretty good job, and it looks pretty much like the original. Honestly, you really couldn't tell it was painted over. Vortex made its American premiere at the Miami-Dade Youth Fair. After this fair, Vortex visited some other fairs in the US in Indiana, Ohio, Tennessee, Alabama, and North Carolina. One at the North Carolina State Fair on the 24th of October 2013, disaster struck. The ride started moving while passengers were still getting off the ride. This injured 4 passengers and 1 worker. Some of them were actually very seriously injured, and one was in a coma for multiple weeks. The cause was determined to be jumpers added illegally by the ride's new owner, John Macaroni, that bypassed the safety system that would normally not allow the ride to move with the seats unlocked. More about this in a future What Really Happened, as there's a lot to unpack here. Less than 3 years after the incident, Vortex made a comeback. It was renamed to XXL and was under ownership of the Murphy Brothers Midway. However, this comeback did not last long. XXL did at least 3 fairs, 2 of them being in North Dakota in July 2016. By December 2016, it was already back up for sale, stating it was located in Texas. Later, another sale advertisement went up saying it was located in Mexico. Since then, nothing is known about this Vortex, and we sadly do not know its current state or location.
The second Vortex with outside-facing seats made its debut in 1999 at the Frühlingsfest in Nuremberg, Germany, with showman Klunde. Klunde ended up traveling with the Vortex in Germany for 11 years. It was put in storage after the 2010 season. In 2013, the Vortex made a comeback on the Dutch fairs with showman Van der Wiel. This was not the first time that Vortex did a Dutch fair, since Klunder already visited some Dutch fairs like Weert in the early 2000s. Vortex's first fair under the new ownership was the Paaskermis in Drachten in late March 2013. Sadly, it already did its last fair under this owner in October 2013 at the Najaarskermis in Nijmegen. It was later sold to a British showman Noble who took it to the Global Village in Dubai in late 2014. It stayed there until early 2016. It was then sold to Baghdad Island in Iraq. It operated there until around October last year. It was then removed from the park and is currently stored in Erbil, Iraq, and up for sale.
That sadly means none of the two Vortexes are left operating. The chances of seeing both of them back are not very high, but we can always hope for the best. Technical Park still has the Vortex on their site, and they have it on a brochure for MyAppa this past year, so one still could be produced any day now. That about concludes everything that we have on these Vortexes. If you did get to ride one of them, please share your experience in the comments below, or if you know anything about where these rides ended up, we would be happy to find out more. I did have a chance to ride it at the Ohio State Fair in 2013, but knowing what I know now about John Macaroni's ownership of the ride, I'm glad I didn't. But I wish that the ride was still traveling in the US, as it was one of the more unique attractions on the US Fair circuit.
And I have also seen the same Vortex when it came to Belgium in a town near me in 2012, but I sadly was too young to ride. I do remember it being a really beautiful ride though, and even seeing footage of it now, it's just so satisfying to see the Vortex moving. The decorations are just so beautiful, the hand-painted backdrop, the beautiful lights. It's amazing, it's a shame I had to miss out on it, and I really wish we could see it back one day.
Yeah, I think it's just crazy that both of us saw the ride within 2 years of each other. It definitely was a very mesmerizing ride to look at, and I'm sure it was very enjoyable. It's definitely very sad that this 2013 accident seems to have sealed its fate, especially since the ride did nothing wrong. The full accident report is out there. It'll probably be linked in the description. It's a fantastic read, but basically the ride itself was perfectly fine. It was the ownership and operation under John Macaroni that actually caused the accident itself. So it's very unfortunate that it is gone now. The Zamperla Discovery is one of the most iconic pendulum rides of all time. With installations around the world at parks big and small, it has proven to be one of the most successful flat rides of the last 20 years. The prototype Discovery debuted in 2004 at the now-defunct Kumdori Land in South Korea. The ride was named Blizzard and would remain very popular up until the park's closing in 2012. This model of Discovery features 30 seats with over-the-shoulder restraints, giving it the model name Discovery 30. The ride reaches heights up to 26 meters or 85 feet and swings up to 120 degrees. It's capable of processing up to 750 riders per hour and is only available as a park version. Many Discovery 30s have been produced and the model is still in production today, with the most recent installation of this ride at the time of this video being the one at Poulton's Park in the UK. In 2006, Zamperla introduced an upgraded version of the Discovery 30 named the Discovery 40, or the Giant Discovery. This new ride was a massive 44.8 meters or 146 feet tall, and as the name implies, has 40 seats. Like the original, it can swing out up to 120 degrees, and it can process up to 800 riders per hour, and it is also only available as a park model. Like the original, the Giant Discovery has proven to be extremely popular, with parks all around the globe buying them, with a few well-known examples being Black Widow at Kennywood, Riddler Revenge at Six Flags Over Texas, and Harley Quinn Spin Sanity at Six Flags America. Yeah, we'll get back to that one in a moment. Zamperla took the Discovery to a new market in 2009 with the introduction of the Discovery 16, or the Midi Discovery, with the first model being installed at Luna Park Coney Island in 2009. This ride swings up to a height of only 15.5 meters or 50.8 feet and has a capacity of 380 riders per hour. Like the larger Discoveries, this ride swings up to a maximum of 120 degrees. Like all the Discoveries before it, this ride is only available in a park version, surprising considering its size. This ride is marketed mostly to small parks and family entertainment centers. It has proven to be pretty popular, though not quite as popular as some of the other Discoveries that we'll cover in a moment. It has sparked many other spin-off rides, both designed by Zamperla and other manufacturers. With 3 successful ride models already in production, Zamperla decided to take the Discovery 30 and the Midi Discovery and add a counterweight to the top of their swing arms. This gave these rides the ability to invert and even stop while being inverted to give the riders an extra sense of hang time. The resulting ride model was named the Discovery Revolution. The smaller MIDI Discovery based version of this ride has proven to be more popular than the 30-seat version, with tons of small parks and family entertainment centers buying them, with a few installations being at Waldameer, Kentucky Kingdom, and Nickelodeon Universe at American Dream. The MIDI version of the Discovery Revolution is the only Zamperla Discovery that comes in a trailer-mounted version. In 2018, Zamperla introduced what is, in my opinion, their best flat ride yet, the Giga Discovery. Taking the world record as the tallest and fastest non-transportable pendulum ride in the world, the Giga Discovery is massive. It reaches a maximum height of 52.5 meters or 172 feet and swings out over 130 degrees. This ride is impressive regardless of whether you're watching it or riding. It reaches a max speed of 110 kilometers per hour or 68 miles per hour. Interestingly, its main support arm is actually only 3 meters higher than the Giant Discovery, 30 meters compared to 27 meters. However, its high swinging angle of 130 degrees allows it to reach much higher heights. It has the same 40-seat rider vehicle as the Giant Discovery, giving it a lower hourly capacity of 600 riders per hour due to its longer cycle. Currently, only 3 Giga Discoveries exist. The prototype was installed at Six Flags Magic Mountain and is named Crazanity. This ride opened in 2018. The second Giga Discovery was installed at Six Flags Great Adventure and is named Wonder Woman Lasso of Truth. This ride opened in early summer 2019. And the newest Giga Discovery was installed at Six Flags Fiesta Texas and is named the Joker Carnival of Chaos. This ride opened in August 2019. Unlike the previous 2 Giga Discoveries, this ride features a fully themed queue that features an interactive funhouse and several other elements of theming. Now moving on a little bit, Zamperla Discoveries have had a very safe history, with only a few minor incidents to speak of. The restraints on the Discoveries do come down automatically, and if not properly maintained, they can do this with some force. This has caused some discomfort and pain to some riders. The most notable accident involving a Discovery was what happened on the Giant Discovery Harley Quinn Spinsanity at Six Flags America in June 2021. An error caused one of the ride's pendulum drive motors to start while the brakes were applied to the pendulum. This caused one side of the ride's supports to shake violently. Eventually the ride's power was cut, but extensive damage was done to the ride and it has yet to reopen. As of the creation of this video, the ride is no longer listed on Six Flags America's website, though it's hoped that it will reopen this year. All the riders on that ride were completely safe though and escaped without any injuries. Now, I have been on several models of the Zamperla Discovery, as well as several other models of pendulum rides that are similar. I rode the Giant Discovery at Six Flags Over Texas and found it to just kind of be okay. It's definitely a good ride, but I wouldn't say it's anything special compared to its competition like the Huss Giant Frisbee. I've also been on several MIDI Discovery Revolutions, including Chaos at Waldameer and Krang Prime Pandemonium at American Dream. So Chaos was certainly not the best ride I've ever had. I had a lot of friends ride it and say it was awful, so I went in with pretty low expectations, and I would say they were about met. It's definitely not that comfortable. It's just in general, it just kind of hurts, and it really isn't that fun. You just kind of hang upside down, and the restraints do crush you quite a bit. I definitely prefer the SBF version of this ride, which can be found at the Fun Spot parks in Orlando and Kissimmee. That's definitely a lot more enjoyable. You feel a lot more forces on that, whereas this just kind of felt like I was being held upside down. It almost reminded me of a Larson loop. And then Krang Prime Pandemonium, on the other hand, was the exact opposite situation, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you think about it, because it's the same ride. However, this ride is absolutely fantastic. If you get the chance to go to American Dream, this is the only good ride there. That park really, I did not enjoy it. I think it's the worst park I've ever been to. But Krang Prime Pandemonium is definitely the best ride in that park. Wow, what a good ride. The way you just kind of fly up into the ceiling, and there's kind of a ceiling fan nearby too. You just get so many forces and so many kind of near misses elements with the ceiling. It's really awesome. It's genuinely one of the best pendulums I've been on. So, I mean, in all honesty, it's the only reason to go to American Dream. I have also had the pleasure of riding 2 out of the 3 Giga Discoveries, Joker and Wonder Woman. I rode Wonder Woman on its pass holder preview day in 2019 by accident. I had no plans to be there, however, it was definitely good that I rode it. It was a really fun ride. I actually got a pin for riding it. And I really enjoyed it, having only done the Husses prior to this. It definitely caught me off guard a little bit. The airtime is definitely a lot stronger than the Husses, and the general kind of free fall sensation, as well as the positive G's at the bottom, are obviously a bit more intense than the smaller Huss models. You just feel like you have so much more mass being flung around. I guess that's the best way to describe it. This is definitely a good ride. Only got one ride of it because it was the pass holder preview day. I just thought it was open, and then I asked for my season pass. So it's okay, well, you know, it's $10 a month, so of course I have a Six Flags season pass. So I went in and rode it. It was great. Haven't rode it since, but definitely worth riding. It's one of the best reasons to go to Great Adventure, because there's not a lot of good reasons to go to Great Adventure, but this is definitely one of them. And then Joker is a completely opposite experience, because there's a ton of great reasons to go to Fiesta, Texas. Joker was under construction when I first visited Fiesta, Texas in 2018. I visited again in late 2020 and was amazed. This ride has a fully themed queue with amazing audio. The placement of the ride is absolutely fantastic. Obviously, being in Fiesta, Texas, it's going to be great to begin with, but just where it is with relative to other rides in the park, also kind of how they theme the whole area around it with the re-theme of the Wave Swinger too, it just really fits in. So you've got the fully themed queue with a freaking fun house that you go through. I mean, where else are you going to see that? That was awesome. The operations were also fantastic. I mean, they were flying through riders as much as you can with a flat ride, and they absolutely were killing it there. The surrounding theming of the whole area, it just felt really nice. You could, blink and think you were at Universal. That's the kind of quality of this ride. And of course, when you're actually on the ride, it's so giant, especially where it's placed. It just looks huge. And you kind of fly up over where you can see over the quarry wall. So it's super awesome. The airtime is great. The positives are great. I thought it was better than Wonder Woman, but not by much. They're probably the same, and I'm just not remembering quite right. And also it had a really long cycle. So definitely really enjoyed that. It's probably my favorite pendulum ride that I've ever been on to date. If you are ever in the area where you have the option to go to Fiesta, Texas, absolutely go. It's a great park, and they have Joker, which is certainly one of their best additions. The first concept art of the KMG Afterburner was released in October of 1997. The Afterburner uses the same claw-like structure as the KMG Move It 24, which debuted 1 year prior to the Afterburner, with 6 gondolas that each seat 4 people. The Afterburner can swing up to an angle of 120 degrees, and the claw can rotate at a maximum of 15 revolutions per minute. The ride is transported on 2 trailers and takes roughly 3 to 4 hours to set up with 3 people.
The first Afterburner debuted in 1998 at the fair in Best in the Netherlands. The prototype was named Beach Party, and it was owned by Dutch showman Van Lith. The Afterburner was an immediate success. KMG produced about 10 of them in just the first 2 years. KMG has constructed at least 43 trailer-mounted Afterburners and 4 park versions. One of these park versions, It at Maurice Piers, which opened in 2011, has a lap bar restraint system, unlike the usual over-the-shoulder restraints. This is currently the only Afterburner that has this type of restraint. In 2016, KMG introduced a second generation of the Afterburner with some minor improvements to the design. The most notable visual difference is that the top of the main arm is square and not round like on the old design.
In July 2017, a major accident happened with a KMG Afterburner at the Ohio State Fair. Rust caused by the ride's flawed outdoor storage design and a lack of inspection on the inside of the sweep arms caused one arm of a KMG Afterburner owned by Amusements of America to break off during a ride cycle. This accident ended up completely changing how rides are inspected in the state of Ohio, and it has had a ripple effect through the entire industry. KMG shortly after issued a service bulletin mandating frequent inspections of the area that failed, followed by a full refurbishment of the sweep arms with modification after the fair season ended. You can watch the What Really Happened video on this accident to learn more about it.
And in 2001, KMG built the Afterburner 32, which is a slightly bigger version of the original Afterburner. It has 8 gondolas instead of 6, making for a capacity of 32 riders per cycle. After the prototype was set up at the KMG factory for testing, It was built at Thorpe Park in the UK, and it remains to be the only Afterburner 32 built by KMG. On KMG's site, the ride is referred to as Vortex, and it's offered as a park version, but also as a transportable version if that's wished.
This exact model of Afterburner has also been produced by Chance Rides under license from KMG. Chance named it the Revolution 32. The first Revolution 32 was constructed by Chance and made its debut in 2002 at California's Great America under the name Delirium. 3 other Revolution 32s were built. An interesting fact is that the Chance Revolution 32 runs a lot slower than KMG's Afterburner 32. The Chance version runs at 9 revolutions per minute, while KMG says theirs rotates at 15 revolutions per minute. Chance does not seem to produce the Revolution 32 since it is no longer mentioned on their website. Now, Chance does still produce multiple versions of the Afterburner. These are also under license from KMG. These ones are named the Revolution 20 and Revolution 16. However, on Chance's current site, it all falls under the designation of the Revolution 20. This ride is designed to be a less expensive way for American parks to get an Afterburner. Unlike the KMG Afterburner, the Revolution 20 comes standard with 4 gondolas, but can be upgraded to a maximum of 5 for a total of 20 riders per cycle. Some riders also claim that the Revolution 20 is less intense, and that the restraints are less comfortable than the traditional Afterburner. The Revolution 20 is only available as a park version, as it requires a pit dug under the ride so that the large lowering floor can be added. The Revolution 20 can swing up to 120 degrees and reaches heights of 68 feet or 20.7 meters. These rides can be found at many American parks, such as Nickelodeon Universe at Mall of America. Chance Rides still produce the Revolution 20, however, with increased competition from other manufacturers and the low capacity of the smaller version of the Revolution, it's unclear if any more will be sold.
There is some very close competition to the Afterburner. Take for example Fabri's Space Jam or Zamperla's Discovery 24, which are both very similar to KMG's Afterburner. However, they never came close to being as successful as the Afterburner.
Now moving on to the ride experience a little bit. I have never experienced a KMG version of this ride, unfortunately. I just haven't really been to a fair where there's been one operating that I wanted to really ride. I hope to change that soon. I have been on a Chance version, and we'll get to that in a moment. But first, we're going to go to Alex, who has ridden multiple of the KMG version of the Afterburner.
I have been on 5 Afterburners, which are all trailer models. However, one of them was in a park at Drivlit, and just all of the Afterburners I experienced were really, really good. The forces you get when it swings on the bottom, very great positives. And when you swing up, you get some really, really great airtime. You really get thrown out of your seat, and then you get completely pushed in your seat when you swing down. It's amazing. The claw can spin very fast, it's super forceful. It's an extremely enjoyable ride. If you ever see one, be sure to ride it, it's really worth it. I love Afterburners. I'm lucky enough to have one at my local fair almost every year. Like, it's at my doorstep, 3-minute walk, and I'm on an Afterburner. It's amazing.
Afterburners are very popular here in the US at fairs as well. You can find them at many different traveling fairs. I do hope to ride one soon, but in the meantime, as I said before, I have been on a Chance Revolution 32, the Claw at Hershey Park. Now this ride was really pretty good. For a pendulum of its size, it's probably the best one that I've done. Now, it has really good airtime in my experience, but the positives really were not as spectacular as I was hoping, perhaps. It was definitely noticeable, but I wouldn't say it was better than like a Zamperla MIDI Discovery Revolution or something like that, or even an SBF version. It was much more focused on the airtime than it is on the positives. It's still a good ride, though. Definitely enjoyed it. The floor design is very interesting. It seems very inefficient. Basically, the entire floor like swivels up underneath the ride, which just causes a big pit to be under the ride. I mean, it works, I guess. It just seems a little bit inefficient. It takes quite a while for it to lower before the ride can start cycling as well. which I could imagine would be a serious problem for the lower capacity versions of these rides. Obviously, Hershey Park has the 32, which is at least a little bit better. But again, it was a very fun ride for its size. It's probably my favorite small pendulum, and again, better than a lot of the other small pendulum offerings. Huss introduced the first Frisbee ride in 1994. The Frisbee is a swinging pendulum ride with a disc-like gondola that seats 40 people facing to the inside. The arm can swing up to 90 degrees and is powered by a tire drive system located under the gondola when in a parking position. A very similar system can also be found on Huss's pirate ships. They also use a very similar system for the transportable units to set up the supports. The Frisbee was available in both transportable and park versions.
The transportable version fits on 5 trailers. The first Huss Frisbee made its debut with German showman Robraun on the Freimarkt in Bremen in 1994. Huss ended up producing 19 Frisbees in total, 8 of which were originally transportable and 11 permanent versions. Huss built their last original Frisbee in 2003 for the British amusement park Pleasure Island, which sadly closed down in 2016. This Frisbee now operates at another park in the UK named Flambard.
Sadly, out of the 8 transportable Huss Frisbees produced, none of them are still actively traveling. There are, however, still 16 Huss Frisbees operating at parks around the world. Italian manufacturers like Fabri and SBF Visa have made copies of the original Huss Frisbees. The easiest way to tell an original Huss Frisbee apart from a copy is the drive system. If the ride is not powered by a drive tire system under the gondola, it's definitely not a Huss.
And in 2004, Huss constructed the Frisbee 34. The Frisbee 34 is basically an original Huss Frisbee but with outside-facing seats and a lower capacity of 34 riders per cycle instead of 40. The maximum speed of the gondola is also reduced to 12 revolutions per minute, while the original Frisbee can rotate at 17 revolutions per minute. The only Frisbee 34 is named Free Swing and is located at Tongdo Fantasia in South Korea. Free Swing still operates there to this day.
The Huss Giant Frisbee was introduced in 2003. That is the same year that the original Frisbee was discontinued. The ride was an evolution of the original Frisbee design intended to be sold to large parks. While the idea for the Frisbee came from the original Huss Frisbee, the design itself was completely changed. The Giant Frisbee did away with the wheel-like drive system found on the Pirate and original Frisbee, replacing it with a set of high-power electric motors found at the top of the pendulum. These propel a massive 19-meter or 62-foot pendulum arm that can swing up to 120 degrees. This pendulum arm is connected to a completely redesigned gondola. This new gondola seats between 40 and 50 riders facing outside, depending on the model chosen. This makes the 50-seat version the highest capacity pendulum ride ever produced, other than the Super Pendulum by Chinese manufacturer Juha Rides, and that ride can seat 54 riders. The ride, when not operating, stands at 24 meters or 79 feet, and when at full swing it apparently stands at 43 meters or 141 feet. These are the numbers officially given by Huss. However, adding the height of the pendulum arm and the height of the structure, we get 43 meters, meaning that the ride would have to be pretty much completely upside down to reach this height. Huss also advertised that the ride can hit 1,000 riders per hour on the 40-seat version, or 1,250 riders on the 50-seat version. However, achieving this would require 25 cycles per hour. However, this does not seem to be possible. Each ride cycle, as timed by a POV, as Huss curiously does not give an average cycle time, seems to last about 130 seconds. That's not counting loading or unloading, just the amount of time it takes for the ride to run one cycle. This means that the absolute maximum number of cycles that a Huss Giant Frisbee can do in an hour with this cycle time is 23 cycles, leading to an absolute maximum capacity of 1,150 riders per hour for the 50-seat version and 920 riders per hour for the 40-seat version. Of course, as mentioned before, this is not counting loading and unloading, and this will vary from park to park depending on a number of factors. So, in taking into account the words of a former operator of one of the Giant Frisbees, they said to me that a good hour was about 12 cycles on a 50-seat version, which gave them a maximum capacity of 600 riders per hour at the absolute best of times, and that is, of course, accounting for loading and unloading, as well as the cycle time. Now, the first Huss Giant Frisbee was sold to Paramount's Kings Island in 2003. It was named Delirium and was set up in the Action Zone section of the park, where it still stands today. Huss advertised to Kings Island that this ride could reach speeds of up to 122 kilometers per hour, or 76 miles per hour, and pull up to 4.5 Gs. Though, as we have seen before, it would not be surprising if these stats are exaggerated.
Delirium was a huge hit for Kings Island, and it cleared the way for more Huss Giant Frisbees to be sold. In 2004, 3 Giant Frisbees were sold, opening as Giant Frisbee at Nagashima Spa-Land in Japan, Tondemina at Fuji-Q Highland, also in Japan, and Sledgehammer at Bobbejaanland in Europe, and this is the only Giant Frisbee Huss produced for Europe.
In 2005, Cedar Point looked to one-up Kings Island by adding Max Air, another Huss Giant Frisbee. Following this, 3 more Giant Frisbees were sold to parks in China. Apollo opened at Happy Valley Beijing in 2006, Giant Frisbee opened at Chimlong Paradise in 2007, and Storm opened at Romanyu Park in 2015. After these 3 rides, only one other Giant Frisbee is known to have been sold, and this one was also named Giant Frisbee and was sold to Magic Mountain the amusement park in India in 2019. Interestingly, the last 2 Giant Frisbees sold by Huss have both been 40-seat versions. Huss still heavily promotes and advertises the Giant Frisbee as one of their most popular rides. Now, of course, the Giant Frisbee and Frisbee both sparked a lot of competition. These 2 rides basically created an entirely new genre of ride that still thrives today, though Huss themselves have seen little of this success. With the KMG Afterburner becoming a much more popular alternative to the normal Frisbee, and the Zamperla Discovery becoming a much more popular alternative to the Giant Frisbee. Huss themselves were rumored to release more variations on the original Frisbee, with rumors saying that they would unveil a Frisbee XL at the 2003 IAAPA Expo, and this ride would have been a mix of the Giant Frisbee with a larger version of the original Frisbee gondola. There were also rumors that they would produce a Giant Frisbee 55, a 55-seat version of the original Giant Frisbee. However, neither of these rumors ended up coming true, and currently the only Huss Frisbee you can still buy is the Giant Frisbee. Alright, so I have had the pleasure of riding 2 of the Huss Giant Frisbees. Both of them are the only 2 located in the United States, and both of them in Ohio, oddly enough. So I did ride Delirium and Max Air. Of the 2, I always preferred Max Air. It just felt like it had a more intense cycle. That being said, if any of you are aware of the situation with Max Air, well, it's not been open since 2019 reliably. It was open a little bit in 2020, and they tried to open it last year, but it's not really been open consistently since 2019. However, it is reopening in 2022, which is why it's such a great time to be making this video. And it really is a good ride, and I'm really happy that it is reopening. It's a very popular ride for the park. In the years that it's been closed, I've gotten questions all the time, when is Max Air going to open? It's very popular for the park overall. It's very visually impressive, especially in the location it is in. It just looks huge when you're walking down that midway towards Gatekeeper. So it's a really nice ride, really good addition for the park. I'm really hopeful that it has a smooth year this year, and more people get to experience it. As far as the ride experience itself goes, this was the first pendulum ride that I ever rode. I believe I did Max Air first, could have been Delirium. But either way, as a kind of standard candle to measure against other rides, it's really good. I'd say it's right in the middle. You get some good airtime, you get some good forces. The restraints on it, honestly, are kind of uncomfortable. They are very bulky, like around your ears, which, I mean, you're not going to get headbanging, you know, it's not a roller coaster, but it's still kind of awkward. So I'm not a huge fan of that compared to like the Zamperla Discovery, which has much more thin restraints. And compared to a Discovery, I would say it's about on par with a Giant Discovery, and I would take the Giga Discovery over it. But it's still a very, very good ride, and definitely a ride that you should look forward to riding if you are in the state of Ohio, because these rides are seemingly kind of rare, which is kind of weird. Alright, so that's my experience with the Giant Frisbee. Now, Alex has been fortunate enough to be able to ride both the Giant Frisbee at Bobbejaanland and a couple of the standard Frisbees.
So yeah, I did ride the only Giant Frisbee in Europe at Bobbejaanland. It was okay, just the cycle was really short in my opinion. It hit the top like 2 or 3 times, which is not enough in my opinion. But well, and as you said, the restraints definitely aren't the best, but I don't really mind it that much on this ride. But still a very enjoyable, great ride, and I wish we had more of them. And then the original ones, these were really, really good. Definitely the transportable versions. I had the luck to see the last remaining transportable one in 2016, which sadly got sold some years later to the USA. It really was one of the most beautiful rides I've ever seen. The hand-painted decorations all around the ride were just so beautiful. And I've also been on a park version, which was a lot slower, and it definitely was not as intense as the transportable version. But that's just because the park doesn't run it right, if I can say it like this. They don't run it as fast. I have seen another park version at Duinrau, but sadly that one was closed on my visit, and I was very, very pissed because I was really looking forward to ride that one because I heard it was one of, if not the best park version of the Huss Frisbees. But well, I'll have to return to the park to check that one out.
The Frenzy was introduced by ARM Rides of Ohio in late 2013. The Frenzy was based on earlier designs of large pendulum swing rides such as the SNS Scream & Swing. These earlier large pendulum swing rides were not transportable as they were too heavy and required too large of a base to be practically transported. In contrast, the ARM Frenzy is small, seating 12 riders using over-the-shoulder restraints, and short, being just 43 feet or 13.2 meters tall when parked. This allows the Frenzy to be transported on one trailer. The ride weighs roughly 75,000 pounds, or 34,000 kilograms. The Frenzy was designed to provide riders with the same negative G-forces found on larger permanent versions of this ride. To achieve this, the ride swings up to 110 degrees, reaching a maximum swing height of 60 feet or 18.4 meters. Frenzy is able to do all of this without a counterweight and without water tanks to balance the structure. This is achieved through a well-engineered but simple ground support design. Frenzy also features a large lowering floor to allow the ride to swing while allowing riders' feet to pass clearances. The ride uses a single 75 horsepower electric motor. The first and only first-generation ARM Frenzy was sold to Bates Bros Amusements of Ohio. They took it to its first show, the IX Indoor Amusement Park of 2014, in March. The ride drew some attention at this show, but it was not seen as a huge success. The ride was seen sporadically at other Bates Bros shows throughout 2014, including appearing at the Canfield County Fair in Ohio. After this event, the ride was only seen one more time in 2014, being shown off at that year's IAAPA Expo in Orlando. After IAAPA, Frenzy was sold to Billy Tucker, owner of the now-defunct Dixieland Carnival. Billy took the ride to a few shows around Alabama and neighboring states, but the ride got even less attention than it did when it was in Ohio. Dixieland Carnival went bankrupt in 2018, and Bates Bros took this as an opportunity to buy back their old ride. Frenzy returned to Bates Bros in late 2018 and received a full refurbishment with help from ARM. The new and improved Frenzy debuted at the 2019 IX Indoor Amusement Park. Since this event, the ride has continued to travel with Bates Bros to several locations throughout the carnival season. It was slated to make a return to the IX Indoor Amusement Park in 2020, however, COVID canceled this event and possibly all future IX Indoor Amusement Park events. The Frenzy is considered by Bates Bros to be one of their most major rides and is a staple of many events they travel to. The ride is expected to return in 2022 to many Bates Bros events. In early 2017, ARM went back to the drawing board to address complaints about the original design of the Frenzy. Some of these complaints included that the ride was too heavy and that some parts wore out too fast. With the help of MJ Engineering, ARM created the second generation Frenzy. This new design is even lighter than the original, but it's still just as solid. It's also said to be more reliable. The second generation Frenzy was shown off at IAAPA 2018 before being transported to its current owner, Robbie Hauser of West Coast Amusements based out of Canada. Frenzy 2 continues to travel with West Coast Amusements today, though it's unclear how much of a success the ride has been, but it's definitely hoped that the ride is performing well for them. Now, I was lucky enough to get to ride the Frenzy when it was at the IX Indoor Amusement Park in 2019. I really didn't realize it at the time just how rare of a ride this actually was, because if you don't know anything about it and you look at it, it just looks like a knockoff Scream and Swing. But it's really so much more, and it honestly has a lot more to offer than that. So like I said, I got to ride it at the IX Center in 2019. It is a really fun ride. Yes, the over-the-shoulder restraints are a bit restrictive, especially if you're used to the SNS version with the lap bars, but it still has really good airtime. And honestly, the lap bars on the SNS version, if they're pushed down too far, can be kind of uncomfortable, and you don't have that problem with these over-the-shoulder restraints. It feels very solid. You really can't tell that the ride is on a transportable base when you're riding, which is good. You shouldn't be able to feel that. And it's very impressive as far as the forces that you get for a ride of its size. It also is decorated really well. The lights on it are really impressive. It also has flags up on the top on Frenzy number 1. I believe Frenzy number 2 did away with the sun on the top and the flags as well. I believe this was something to do with weight savings and the change in the structure on Frenzy 2. But Frenzy 1 does have the flags and the sign up at the top, which really, I think, adds to the visual appeal of the ride. When you see the flags kind of waving around and switching directions as the pendulum swings either way, it's pretty neat. I don't know why. It's fun to watch, you know? All Frenzies do have an automatic cycle that lasts roughly 120 seconds on both Frenzy 1 and 2. Though it's still a really good cycle, you do get good airtime, as I mentioned before, and it definitely does not feel short. I would definitely say it's a pretty darn good ride, all things considered. The Looping Starship was introduced by Intamin in 1984 as a complement to the original pirate ship ride. The first 2 Looping Starships produced opened at Busch Gardens Tampa and King's Dominion. The ride consists of a large gondola themed to one of 4 theming options or a custom design, with 10 rows of 5 seats, making for a capacity of 50 riders per cycle, facing each other. Later models were available with only 32 seats. The most popular theming option was the Space Shuttle theme. Intamin created a separate model of the Looping Starship, simply named the Space Shuttle, with a standard Space Shuttle theme and size that allowed them to sell this design in large numbers throughout the 1980s and 90s. Looping Starship production essentially stopped in 1992, however Intamin continued to offer the model as well as support the model into the 2000s. A total of 21 Looping Starships were produced, with 12 of these going to North America, 5 going to Japan, and 2 to Europe. The remaining 2 were sold to Australia and Southeast Asia. Most Looping Starships have now closed. This is due to a number of factors. Ridership for these rides is not what it was in the past due to parks coming out with more and better inverting rides. Additionally, now that the Space Shuttle program has long since ended, many see the shuttle design as outdated rather than futuristic. Finally, the maintenance costs for these rides have been quite an issue, mostly due to the complex restraint system employed by these rides, consisting of an automatically lowering lap bar and an over-the-shoulder restraint. With all of these problems, only a few Looping Starships remain operating. There are currently 5 Looping Starships still in operation. 2 of them are in the US, Berserker at King's Dominion and Southern Star, originally named Friendzoid, at Carowinds. There's also Phoenix at Busch Gardens Tampa, which has been standing but not operating for a number of years now, and the ride has also been listed for sale a number of times. It's very unlikely that it will reopen at all, and even more unlikely that it will reopen at Busch Gardens Tampa. There are 2 more operating in Japan, Looping Starship at Yomiuri Land and Space Shuttle at Nagashima Spa Land. And 1 more operating in Malaysia, Pirate's Revenge at Sunway Lagoon. This unit was originally located at Australia's Wonderland Sydney. It's interesting to note that the only 2 remaining Looping Starships that still have their Space Shuttle design are the ones in Japan. All the other ones feature a more traditional pirate ship type of design. Something that's really interesting and worth mentioning is that Leesburg in Sweden had a Looping Starship, but they actually modified it. It operated from 1989 until 2001 in its original configuration, and then in the 2001 off-season, they removed the counterweight structure, making it unable to do the full 360-degree loop, basically converting it back to a normal pirate ship. They also removed the over-the-shoulder restraints, making it a lap bar only ride. Now, this also included a major modification to the fiberglass of the ride, making it look, in my opinion, quite out of place and kind of ugly compared to its original design. The ride was removed from Leesburg in 2008 and is currently still operating at the Italian theme park Movieland Park under the name BC-10 Airlines. Another looping starship that received a major change was the space shuttle that originally opened at Six Flags Astroworld. The ride opened in 1986 and operated as one of the largest attractions for the park up until the park's closure in 2005. After this, the ride was removed and refurbished as well as rethemed. It was also combined with the space shuttle from Six Flags Over Georgia, which also closed in 2005. The new combined ride was themed to an ACME rocket from the Looney Tunes cartoons. This Franken ride operated at Six Flags Over Texas from 2006 to 2014, when it was closed to make space for the queue of Justice League Battle for Metropolis. The ride was scrapped, and parts of it can still be found in the park's scrapyard today. Alright, moving on a bit, here's my friend Bailey, who has operated Berserker at King's Dominion. Bailey, go ahead and walk us through an average ride cycle at Berserker.
Guests begin by walking through the entrance gates, placing anything they may lose mid-cycle on the side of the platform. Once everyone is situated on the bench designated to the row they waited in, the lap bars will come down and lock. There's about a 4 to 5 second time between locking where the bars will be at their tightest, and this is generally regarded as an unpleasant experience. Once the bars ease, the over-the-shoulder restraints are brought down by hand and operators check either by physical or visual confirmation. Once completed, the ride's entire restraint system is locked via 2 buttons on the back right of the boat, and the ride can begin. Generally, you get 2 flips in the same direction, though sometimes 2 in the opposite direction, or even 3 are possible depending on motor speed. Once the ride comes to a full and complete stop, the unit will be unlocked with the same buttons, and guests will be instructed to exit the ride area. One of the more unique aspects of this ride is that at times it needs to be corrected within a certain area in order for the unit's restraints to be unlocked. The panel operator will forward or reverse correct the unit by watching it swing until a dash on the bottom side is within 2 dashes marked on the platform. This type of ride also cannot be operated in any sort of weather with water accumulation, as the drive tires will begin to essentially hydroplane against the base of the unit.
The space shuttle version of the looping starship was prone to several modifications throughout the model's lifetime. For example, the one at Great Adventure came from Intamin with the words Challenger, referencing the shuttle of the same name on the side. That ride opened in 1985. After the Challenger disaster in January 1986, the Challenger text was completely painted over for the ride before it reopened in 1986. Almost all looping starships were modified to have some sort of net or cage over top the riders to prevent their loose articles from falling out and hitting riders on the ground. This was done to almost all looping starships, but several do still operate today without any kind of cage or covering. Additionally, the early looping starships came with engines attached to the back of the space shuttle. These engines were found to vibrate a lot during the ride, so after the first year or two of operation, around 1986, all of these space shuttle type looping starships had their engines removed, making the shuttle look a lot less realistic in my opinion. Well, now that we've talked about both the operation as well as some of the interesting quirks and stories of these rides, let's head out to Carowinds, where we're going to look at one of the remaining operating looping starships in the US, Southern Star, over there at Carowinds, where I rode it just about a week ago. Now I'm here in front of Southern Star at Carowinds. This is one of only 2 remaining looping starships in the United States, with the other being at King's Dominion. Now this ride opened in 1986 as Friendzoid. After 2005, it closed for an extensive refurbishment, and in 2007 it reopened as Southern Star, where it still operates now. Now, let's go for a ride. Alright, so we just got off Southern Star here at Carowinds. Now that is quite an interesting ride. The ride experience is very similar to what you might find on, say, Larson loops. It definitely felt very comparable to that, although a little bit more awkward than that. I think just the restraints, they're very bulky. It kind of holds you down in a certain uncomfortable way. I can kind of see why there's not many of these rides left. That being said, it's very unique, and the kind of hanging feeling you get when you're kind of halfway in between being upside down and not is very unique. So it's definitely an enjoyable ride. If you do get a chance to ride one, I definitely recommend it because they are quite rare. Definitely has some very good hang time up at the top. Definitely feel like you're falling forward. But again, the restraints kind of detract from that. They kind of lower with a lot of pressure, the lap bars part especially, on your lap, and then it releases, and then you have the over-the-shoulder restraint as well. So it's a little bit uncomfortable. Kind of similar to what you might find on Top Spin, honestly. That's what it reminded me of. And then the cycle time on this one's not exactly the longest. I know a lot of the older ones ran with longer cycles. But this one's cycle may not be the longest, but I think it's about the perfect length for the type of intensity that this ride is. The Cuddle Up ride was designed by Burks Engineering in the 1920s. The prototype ride is said to have opened at Carsonia Park in Pennsylvania in 1929. The ride was somewhat like a modern Teacups ride. Unlike a modern Teacups, the riders could not control their spin and the cars moved differently along the ride. On a Teacups ride, the rider cars are mounted to one point on a disc that rotates usually on top of another larger disc. On the original Cuddle Up, the car sat in a trough next to a set of 2 or more interlocking rotating gears. On the base of the cars under the ride floor, there were attachments to connect up to the rotating gears. The cars on top were free spinning and would be thrown from one gear to another. This design created aggressive lateral forces whenever a car transitioned from one gear to another. The intensity of these forces could be altered by controlling how fast these gears spun. These gears would be set up in any design a park desired, making for a unique ride experience. The original ride did not feature any kind of restraint, and it had a large gap in part of the car that was used for rider loading and unloading. This meant that there was a decent chance that riders not holding on would be ejected from the ride. This caused many Cuddle Ups to get seatbelts or doors that covered the opening in the ride's later years. Some famous installations of the original Cuddle Up include Coal Shaker at Hershey Park. This ride opened in 1972 as a replacement for an older Cuddle Up ride in the park. It was one of the last Cuddle Up rides ever built. It was a 5-gear version with custom-themed cars themed to coal. The ride closed at the end of the 1989 season. Interestingly, the ride was so loud that operators reportedly had to wear earplugs when the ride was in operation. There's also Iceberg at Dorney Park. Now, this ride originally opened in 1945 as a 4-gear outdoor attraction. By 1968, the ride was losing popularity, so Dorney Park decided to build a massive concrete iceberg around the ride and pump it full of air conditioning. The ride was updated to have flashing lights and disco music. The ride became a beloved part of Dorney Park for many years. In 1988 or 1989, the ride was closed and rethemed to Meteorite, with the outside of the ride repainted to black. In 1993, the ride would close forever as the last known operating Cuddle Up in the United States. Now, the original Cuddle Up at Carsonia Park would operate there until the park closed in 1950. After this, the ride would be refurbished by PTC and sold to Rocky Springs Park in Pennsylvania. Once this park closed, the ride was put into storage. For a short while, it was the only remaining Cuddle Up in existence. Though it was not operational, many hoped that this historic ride would one day be bought and rebuilt. Sadly, this did not happen, and a few years ago, one of the cars for the ride was found for sale on eBay for $3,500. The car sold, and it is now clear that the original Cuddle Up will never return, though PTC continued to claim to offer the ride through 2005 on their website. After the first few Cuddle Ups were produced by Burks Engineering, the design was sold to Philadelphia Toboggan Company or PTC in the mid-1930s. PTC would continue to make the ride, though after World War II, its popularity began to decline. This prompted PTC to redesign the ride around 1960 as the Crazy Daisy. Unlike the larger Cuddle Up ride, the Crazy Daisy only featured 2 interlocking rotating gears. It was marketed as a family ride, though it's still more intense than most family rides. Later versions of the ride even came with gates or doors covering the large opening in the side of the car. PTC no longer produces this ride, however they do still offer parts for existing rides. A few of these rides do remain operating, with one of the most well-known being Crazy Daisy at Blackpool Pleasure Beach. Though the Cuddle Up and Crazy Daisy are dead or dying off, their design inspired the Zamperla Demolition Derby, which is still in production today. One of the large problems with the Cuddle Up and Crazy Daisy was the wear put on the cars when they switched from one gear to another. On Zamperla's design, this is solved by only having a limited number of slots that the cars can slide into. This also allows the spinning plates to be flush with the rest of the ride area, making the ride much less of a tripping hazard and liability. Zamperla also offers the ability for riders to control their own spin. Though the Zamperla Demolition Derby is nowhere near as intense as the original ride, it's definitely nice to see the original design living on in some form. One of the most well-known installations of the Demolition Derby is Mater's Junkyard Jamboree at Disney's California Adventure. This ride is actually two identical rides that are each an enlarged version of the original design, featuring 4 plates that are each far larger than a standard Demolition Derby. The cars are also different, being inspired by whip rides. They're able to swing out with the lateral forces of the ride. Amusement Labs has produced a great video explaining how this ride works, and I have that video linked below. The history of the Matterhorn stretches all the way back to the development of the first amusement rides in the early 1800s. Back then, very few amusement rides existed, and the entire industry was made up of individual showmen making their own rides, often based off of popular rides owned by other showmen. In this era, a popular ride design began to emerge known as the Roundabout. The Roundabout was a round ride with some form of rotating platform where riders were seated. These rides were originally powered by horses or children in exchange for free rides. Later, they began to be powered by steam engines. With the increased power and speed provided by steam engines, these rides were split into 2 different classes of rides around the 1860s. The first design was slower and usually featured horse-like ride vehicles. This eventually evolved into the modern carousel. The second design was faster and would eventually become the ride we now call a Matterhorn. The proto-Matterhorn evolved in the late 1800s with the addition of hills to the ride track, making for a more extreme ride. One of the first known rides to feature this design was called Switchback and debuted in 1888. Early Switchback rides were also some of the first rides to ever feature music, utilizing a band organ in the center of the ride, establishing a tradition that still follows modern Matterhorns. In the 1920s, a new take on the ride began to be popularized, named the Caterpillar. This ride featured smaller but more numerous rider vehicles that were seated directly behind each other. Unlike a modern Matterhorn, these rides also featured a curtain that would be raised over the riders at certain points on the ride to make the ride more exciting. A few of these rides can still be found operating today, such as Caterpillar at Folly Farm in the UK. Around the mid-1920s, this ride type split once again. One version of the ride would retain the static ride vehicles with an emphasis on lateral forces. These rides would eventually add more hills and become the modern Himalaya ride. The other version of these rides would add swinging cars and would emphasize speed and rapid swinging forces. The first of these rides would be called Moon Rocket. Introduced in the early 1930s, these would be some of the most intense rides of the interwar years. Moon Rocket rides were able to rotate at 16 revolutions per minute, with the center dome of the ride able to rotate at the same speed in the opposite direction, making for an increased sense of speed. At least one of these rides still exists and can be found at Dingle's Fairground Heritage Centre in the UK. After World War II, the development of the Matterhorn rides continued. In 1960, the company HP Jackson of the UK created the Strato Cruiser. This ride featured a new mounting system for rider vehicles that allowed them to swing out more easily. Many credit this ride for bringing the Matterhorn into the modern era. The original Strato Cruiser would continue to travel and operate through 1983, then it was refurbished into a Himalaya ride and continued to operate until 2003. The ride is now in storage with showman Joey Wilson, and it is unlikely to ever reopen. Though the Strato Cruiser is now gone, the rides it went on to inspire remain a staple of nearly every amusement park and fairground. A good modern Matterhorn is known for its powerful swinging motion, high speeds, lights, and banging soundtracks. All of these concepts were introduced slowly over 100 years. Now, modern Matterhorns rest on a legacy of amusement ride history. With this history understood, let's talk about the current generation of Matterhorns. The design of the Stratocruiser drew a lot of attention from US ride manufacturers. In the mid-1960s, Alan Herschel introduced the Flying Bobs. Chance Rides would shortly after buy the rights to this ride in the 1970s. The Flying Bobs featured steeper hills than the Stratocruiser and used smaller two-person rider vehicles. The Flying Bobs became extremely popular in the United States, and most Matterhorns found here are Chance Flying Bobs. No Herschel Flying Bobs are known to still be operating. Sometime in the 1990s, Chance changed the design of the Flying Bobs from a closed-off design of the rider capsule to a more open one. Recently, Chance did unfortunately discontinue the model, though hundreds remain operating. One great example is the Flying Bobs at Fun Spot Kissimmee. This ride was originally a traveling model. It features a great sound system and appears to have the ability for operators to control the cycle. Sadly, this ride is being removed in the next few months and being replaced by a new Matterhorn from Bertizan. There's also a Matterhorn owned by Kissel Entertainment that travels all over the southeastern US and is known for its strobe lights, amazing sound system, train horn, fog, and high speeds. This is an example of the Flying Bobs with a newer, more open seating design that debuted in the 1990s. Unlike most American rides, the Chance Flying Bobs are considerably more intense than some of their European counterparts, though this largely depends on how they're operated. I have found that the Chance Flying Bobs are easier to rock back and forth than most Matterhorns, making for a very intense ride cycle if you're willing to work for it. The Flying Bobs at Fun Spot Kissimmee is truly an amazing ride, and I will talk more about it at the end of this video. As mentioned before, hundreds of other Chance Flying Bobs exist, and if you ever find one, I highly recommend giving it a ride.
Reverchon brought the Matterhorn out of the Dark Ages for Europe. They made their first Matterhorn around 1975 and their last in 1990. They sadly do not make Matterhorns anymore. Their model of the Matterhorn came to be one of the most successful Matterhorn models out there, with about 40 units being sold around the world. Reverchon has different designs for the Matterhorn gondolas, two of them being really similar to their bumper car designs, the Atlanta and the Privilege. There are still Reverchon Matterhorns traveling all around Europe. I could however only find two operating units in the Western Hemisphere, one in Brazil and one in Argentina. The Reverchon Matterhorns all differ from each other, having different angles and steepness of the hills. However, this is minimal and can most of the times not be seen visually. They are also manually operated most of the time, so that can also play a big role in the ride experience.
Mach Ride started making Matterhorns in the early 1970s. These were styled much like the Chance Flying Bobs, however they featured far more lights and decorations than their American counterparts. One of the most well-known of these rides is Matterhorn at Cedar Point, which I've been on several times, and I honestly always thought it was kinda lame. Unlike a Chance Flying Bobs, it does seem to run pretty slow, and in talking to friends who have ridden other Mack Matterhorns, this does not seem like just a Cedar Point problem. The cars are also much harder to swing than the Chance version, and in general, I'm not too big a fan of the Mack version of the Matterhorn.
The defunct manufacturer from Belgium, Sobema, also made a lot of Matterhorns from the 1980s till the mid-1990s. These rides can often be recognized for the lack of a large tent cover over the front half of the ride. However, some of them were originally built with a complete roof, like usual, but most of them don't have it anymore. Sobema had two types of gondolas, a old original sled gondola design and a newer gondola design which looked pretty similar to the Privilege version of Reverchon's gondolas. Sobema's Matterhorns were popular mainly in Belgium, the Netherlands, France and the UK. These countries still have a handful of Sobema Matterhorns traveling. I have been on two Sobemas, which are also very different from each other for the same reason as the Reverchon ones. The Sobema ones can have insane swings, they can also go almost upside down like the Reverchon ones. It also just depends on how it's operated. Like Reverchon ones, they're mainly operated manually.
Bertizan of Italy is the largest ride manufacturer still making Matterhorns today. They offer a 16-seat and a 20-seat Matterhorn, both with quite over-the-top theming. The rides come in several theming options, but the most popular are the Rock and Roll and the Ice Jet themes. These rides can be found traveling and in parks all around the world. As mentioned before, one is coming to Fun Spot Kissimmee later this year, and I'm excited to see how it compares with the late but great Flying Bobs. Now, these are just a few of the most notable Matterhorn manufacturers. Several other manufacturers have made Matterhorns though, such as Heinz Fotz, SDC, Preston and Barbary, and many, many more. Now, both me and Alex have been on an assortment of Matterhorn rides, and rather than talking about the general ride experience of all of these rides, we both decided we would talk about our best rides ever on each of these Matterhorns. So I'll go first. Now, my favorite ride experience on a Matterhorn is the Fun Spot Kissimmee one. So that is a Chance Flying Bobs, an older Flying Bobs from the 70s that is currently at Fun Spot Kissimmee. It's over by the go-karts. It's probably not going to be there for much longer. It actually recently sold on a used ride site. So like I said before, it does have an amazing soundtrack. It plays great music. It's got a pretty good speaker system. And the ride operator appears to have some kind of control over the cycle. Normally you run for probably a minute and a half forward, minute and a half backwards at pretty high speeds. But we actually were just lapping at one time, me and a couple friends. And they noticed we were lapping it, so they just let it keep running and running for probably 6 or 7 minutes, or you're just going crazy. And again, as mentioned before, with these chance ones, you can really easily rock them back and forth. All you have to do is kind of throw your weight from side to side. It's very exhausting to do, but man, is it rewarding, because we were getting these things, because we were all doing it, swinging up against the stops on the swing stops that are up on the part of the sweep arms that connect to the ride vehicles. So we got this swinging all the way up and hitting those consistently, like every time we would get flung out. It was absolutely wild. And then we went in reverse. So it's just crazy. It's absolutely such a social ride to ride with friends and just try and see how high you can get it to swing. So I absolutely love the Chance Flying Bobs, and I do look forward to riding more Matterhorns here in the future. I do plan to ride the Kissel-owned Flying Bobs this summer, and hopefully that ride lives up to the hype. It certainly looks amazing. So, yep. Let's go ahead to Alex now, who's ridden a lot of Matterhorns over in Europe, and see what his favorite Matterhorn ride is.
So in total I have experienced 7 Matterhorns, with my favorite one being the French Shakers, which was built by Reverchon. To me, this ride is pretty much perfect. It gives an excellent long cycle, always like 6 minutes or something. It goes both backwards and forwards in one cycle. It has a great speed, great variation. They speed up the machine, they slow it down, they speed it up. That's the way you should operate a Matterhorn, because you get the best swings when you speed up and slow down. It's really, really great. And the way it's operated, it makes the gauntlets almost swing upside down. It's insane. You don't even have to do any effort to make them swing. It just goes all by itself. It's excellent. The atmosphere on the ride is always great as well. Good music, good people, good vibes. The operator speaks a lot through the mic. Every time I see this machine, I ride it a lot. I look at it, I'm in love with it. It's just such a beautiful ride, such an amazing ride to experience. I love it. Then also I've been on some Subima ones, which I also had a lot of pleasure riding. For example, last winter I rode one which comes very close to me, like 40 minutes. This one was a little bit harder to make the gauntlet swing, but with some effort you can actually make it flip almost upside down to its maximum angle. And I've had quite a lot of fun doing that. Lots of people who were standing next to the ride were like looking at me and like, what is he doing? Because you could perfectly see my gauntlet swinging a lot higher than the others. So that was pretty funny too. I really enjoyed that Matterhorn. And yeah, just in general, I love doing Matterhorns. They are always very variating from each other. You'll never get the same experience twice. And it's a really fun ride to do.
Thanks for watching this compilation of Flat Ride of the Week Season 2. Hopefully you learned something. Flat Ride of the Week Season 3 debuts next week.